The transformation of Rome from a modest cluster of Iron Age settlements along the banks of the river Tiber into the unquestioned hegemon of the Italian peninsula represents one of the most profound socio-economic and political evolutions in human history. By the eve of the First Punic War in 264 BCE, Rome had consolidated a vast network of territories and alliances, positioning itself as a formidable Mediterranean power capable of challenging the established empire of Carthage. However, this outward projection of military and geopolitical strength was entirely predicated upon centuries of intense internal development, violent class conflict, and the systematic restructuring of the Roman agrarian economy. The political economy of the Roman kingdom and the early republic was intrinsically tied to the land. In this pre-industrial agrarian society, land was the absolute determinant of wealth, social status, military obligation, and political franchise. To understand the rise of Rome is to understand a delicate, often bloody balance between a subsistence agricultural economy and the expanding ambitions of a militaristic aristocratic state. As the city expanded its territorial reach through continuous warfare, it inevitably triggered a severe internal crisis characterized by the monopolization of resources, the weaponization of debt, and a protracted class struggle between the patrician aristocracy and the plebeian masses. In its formative centuries, the Roman economy was fundamentally agrarian, heavily relying on the grueling labor of small, largely self-sufficient family units. The geographic positioning of Rome, set 16 miles inland upon 7 easily fortified hills, provided strategic immunity from sudden naval incursions, while the Tiber River facilitated early local trade and communication. However, the economic backbone of this early society was not the merchant or the artisan, but the smallholder farmer. The vast majority of the population was engaged in cultivating the rugged, diverse, and often unforgiving terrain of central Italy. The early Roman agricultural model was centered on the concept of the heredium, a small hereditary plot of land passed down through generations. These small farms, typically ranging from 18 to 108 jugera, approximately 11.7 to 70.2 acres, were designed primarily for basic subsistence rather than surplus commercial production. The Mediterranean climate, characterized by hot, dry summers and cool, wet winters, dictated a specific triad of staple crops that would sustain the population: grains, olives, and grapes. Emmer, spelt, and millet were the earliest staple grains cultivated, providing the overwhelming majority of caloric intake for the rural population. Over time, as agricultural techniques evolved and the urban population gradually expanded, durum wheat was introduced around 450 BCE. Durum wheat quickly became the preferred grain of urban Romans because it could be baked into leavened bread and was far easier to cultivate in the dry Mediterranean region than common soft wheat. Agriculture in this era was not merely a physical necessity or an economic activity. It was deeply idealized as the ultimate expression of Roman virtue, morality, and civic duty. Historical agronomists, statesmen, and poets consistently praised the moral fortitude derived from working the land. The statesman Cicero considered farming the best of all Roman occupations, describing it as the ultimate teacher of economy, industry, and justice. The elder Cato provided early guidance on the ideal farm, suggesting that the most desirable estates included a diverse mix of vineyards, irrigated gardens, olive orchards, meadows, and grain land. Virgil, reflecting on the agrarian lifestyle, outlined the pastoral life of early Rome as one of simple survival, where ordinary civilians engaged in an arduous but morally pure existence. This ideological veneration of the small farmer served a vital dual purpose. It maintained social cohesion and provided a physically hardened, highly motivated demographic pool for the Roman military. In the absence of a modern credit system or a standardized fiat currency, the early Roman economy operated primarily through complex bartering systems. Wealth was frequently measured and stored in livestock, predominantly cattle and sheep. This agrarian reality is permanently reflected in the Latin language itself, where the word for money, pecunia, is directly derived from pecus, meaning flock or herd. As trade requirements grew slightly more complex and bartering livestock became highly impractical for smaller or more distant transactions, the Romans adopted the use of raw, irregular lumps of bronze known as is rude as a medium of exchange. The introduction of is rude represented a tentative step toward a monetized economy, but it remained a deeply cumbersome system. Because these raw bronze ingots completely lacked a standardized shape, size, or weight, they had to be physically weighed on a scale during every single transaction to determine their precise value. This rudimentary proto-currency system was generally sufficient for a localized, highly agrarian society focused on subsistence. However, as Rome began to aggressively project military power outward and absorb neighboring territories, the severe limitations of an economy based on is rude and localized agricultural surplus would soon become apparent, necessitating profound structural and monetary changes. The intersection of agricultural wealth, political power, and military obligation in early Rome was formalized through the Servian constitution, a sweeping set of administrative reforms traditionally attributed to the sixth king of Rome, Servius Tullius, who reigned in the 6th century BCE. While modern scholars recognize that these reforms were likely a gradual, piecemeal process extending into the early Republic, the Servian system fundamentally redefined the fiscal and military structure of the Roman state. The cornerstone of the Servian constitution was the institution of the census. Every adult male citizen was required to register his social rank, his household composition, and most importantly, his property and income. This comprehensive evaluation of wealth was based primarily on land ownership and the head of livestock, establishing an individual's tax liabilities and their capacity to muster arms at their own expense. The census classified the citizen population into distinct socio-economic classes, which were then subdivided into military and political units called centuries or centuria. This system inextricably linked a citizen's economic status to their political franchise and military duty. The wealthiest citizens, who could afford the most expensive armor, weapons, and horses, were placed in the highest classes and expected to serve in the cavalry or the heavily armed frontline infantry. For example, the first class required a property valuation of 100,000 asses and was heavily represented in the military structure, while the fifth class, requiring only 11,000 asses, was expected to provide only basic infantry equipped with slings and javelins. Those without significant property, the proletarii or capitae censi, those counted only by their heads, were generally exempt from standard military service, but possessed virtually no political power. Crucially, these military centuries doubled as voting blocks in a new legislative assembly known as the Comitia Centuriata. Because the wealthiest classes were allocated the majority of the centuries, they held a decisive, insurmountable voting majority, even though they represented a small minority of the actual population. The voting proceeded in order of wealth, and if the top classes agreed on a measure or candidate, a majority was reached, and the poorer classes were not even called upon to cast their votes. The Servian constitution thus institutionalized an elective oligarchy. It entrusted the military defense of the state to property-owning citizens, creating a deep interdependency among the classes, but it firmly concentrated political dominance in the hands of the landed elite. This militarization of wealth set the stage for the intense class conflicts that would dominate the early republic. The continuous expansion of Roman territory through warfare fundamentally altered the agrarian foundations of the state, initiating a brutal process that modern political economists recognize as the primitive accumulation of capital and land. Primitive accumulation, a concept foundational to the analysis of the origins of capitalist social relations, describes the historical process of divorcing the producer from the means of production, often through extra economic force, violence, and state-sanctioned enclosure. In the context of the early Roman Republic, this theoretical framework perfectly encapsulates the systematic marginalization of the plebeian smallholders by the patrician elite. As the Roman military marched outward, conquering neighboring tribes such as the Sabines, Volscians, and Etruscans, the state confiscated vast tracts of highly fertile territory. This confiscated land was incorporated into the state domain as Ager Publicus, or public land. In legal theory, this newly acquired territory belonged to the Roman people collectively, serving as a shared resource that could be leased, farmed, or grazed upon by the citizenry. In brutal practice, however, its distribution and usage became the primary catalyst for the most severe class divides in early Roman history. The patrician elite, leveraging their immense pre-existing wealth, their entrenched political influence, and their monopoly on senior magistracies, systematically encroached upon and enclosed the Ager Publicus. They utilized this public land for expansive, unregulated grazing of their massive herds and for establishing large-scale agricultural estates. This aggressive economic accumulation of land effectively privatized public assets, walling off resources from the lower classes. The economic disparity became staggering. While the standard plots of land granted to poor Roman citizens were often a mere 2 jugera, an amount barely sufficient to feed a single family, the patrician estates grew exponentially, eventually forming the vast, slave-operated Latifundia that would permanently disfigure the Italian countryside in the later Republic. This aggressive economic polarization was intrinsically linked to the heavy military obligations of the Roman citizen body. Under the Servian system, the plebeian smallholders formed the vital backbone of the infantry. As Rome's conflicts grew more frequent, geographically distant, and protracted, these citizen soldiers were pulled away from their farms for extended campaigns. The economic consequences for the smallholder were nothing short of catastrophic. While away shedding blood for the expansion of the state, their fields lay fallow, their harvests failed, and their properties were left highly vulnerable to enemy raids. Upon returning from war, many veterans found themselves utterly destitute, unable to sustain their livelihoods, feed their families, or pay the taxes required by the state. These disenfranchised citizen soldiers were forced to sell their remaining ancestral land to the wealthy patricians. This vicious cycle of compulsory military service, forced agricultural neglect, and desperate land sales acted as a highly effective, state-driven mechanism for primitive accumulation. War acted as an extra economic force of extraction, separating the rural producers from their land and transforming independent, self-sufficient farmers into a dependent, impoverished underclass, while simultaneously enriching the elite commanders who directed the campaigns. The loss of land and the immediate, desperate need for survival forced countless displaced plebeians into borrowing money from the wealthy patrician class. In the absence of a modern, regulated credit system or bankruptcy protections, the early Roman Republic relied on a severe, archaic, and deeply exploitative form of debt bondage known as Nexum. Nexum was the specific economic and legal mechanism that formally subjugated the plebeian class, weaponizing their financial desperation into literal physical bondage and servitude. The Nexum contract was formalized through a highly rigid ritualistic transaction known as per ass et librum, by copper and scales, the exact same symbolic transfer of rights utilized in the formal sale of property or slaves. Under this draconian arrangement, a borrower pledged their own physical person, their liberty, and their body as collateral for a loan. If the debtor defaulted on the debt, which was highly probable given the exorbitant interest rates often manipulated by the creditors, they officially became a nexus. The legal mechanics of debt recovery in early Rome were brutally efficient and heavily weighted in favor of the aristocratic creditor. According to the Law of the 12 Tables, the foundational written legal code established in the mid-5th century BCE, a debtor who admitted their debt or was formally condemned by a judge was granted a strict 30-day grace period to produce the necessary funds. If the debt remained unpaid after these 30 days had elapsed, the creditor was legally authorized to execute manus injectio, the laying on of hands, allowing them to physically seize the debtor without further trial. Once seized, the creditor could imprison the debtor in a private subterranean dungeon known as an ergastulum. The law callously stipulated that the creditor must keep the debtor in iron chains weighing no more than 15 pounds and provide a minimal starvation-level subsistence diet. Over an agonizing period of 60 days, the chained debtor was brought before the magistrate in the forum on 3 successive market days to publicly proclaim the exact amount of their debt, offering a final humiliating chance for family or friends to ransom them. If no rescuer appeared after the 3rd market day, the creditor possessed the terrifying, legally sanctioned right to either sell the debtor into foreign slavery across the Tiber or to execute them. Historical sources even suggest a grim theoretical provision where multiple creditors could cut the debtor into pieces proportionate to their share of the debt, though there is no record of this extreme measure being enacted. While outright execution was rare, the reality of Nexum was a life of grim, inescapable servitude. Debtors were frequently subjected to severe physical abuse, humiliation, and forced labor on the very agricultural estates that the patricians had amassed through the enclosure of public lands. This horrifying dynamic is vividly captured in the historical narrative provided by the historian Livy, who recounts the dramatic story of an elderly centurion appearing in the Roman Forum in the early 5th century BCE. The veteran was severely emaciated, clad in squalid rags, and bore the fresh, bleeding whip marks of his creditor on his back. The centurion passionately explained to the gathered crowd that while he had been away fighting for Rome in the Sabine War, his farm had been ravaged by the enemy and a new tax imposed by the state, forcing him into a usurious loan. He lost his ancestral land and was dragged by his creditor not merely into service, but into a place of execution and torture. This visceral anecdotal evidence underscores the profound social polarization and hypocrisy of the era. The very soldiers responsible for the defense and expansion of the Roman state were simultaneously being enslaved and physically broken by its ruling class at home. The intersecting crises of land deprivation, primitive accumulation, and the horrors of debt bondage ignited a fierce, centuries-long political struggle known as the conflict of the orders. The plebeian class, acutely aware that they constituted both the vast majority of the population and the overwhelming bulk of the Roman military infantry, realized they possessed a supreme strategic leverage against the patrician oligarchy: the total withdrawal of their labor and their martial service. This highly organized collective resistance manifested in a tactic known as secessio plebis, secession of the plebs, effectively an ancient combination of a mass military mutiny and a general labor strike. The first secession occurred in 494 BCE during a period of severe famine, widespread indebtedness, and intense military pressure from hostile neighboring tribes. The patrician senate, dominated by a closed oligarchy of elite families such as the Claudii, Fabii, and Valerii, continuously refused to enact meaningful debt reforms or curb the abuses of moneylenders. When the consuls attempted to levy the legions to face an impending military threat, the plebeian soldiers, driven to the brink by the immediate threat of Nexum imprisonment, abandoned the city en masse. They marched in unified formation to the Mons Sacer, located 3 miles outside the city walls of Rome, beyond the river Anio. There, they established a fortified military camp with ramparts and trenches, explicitly refusing to fight the enemy or work the fields. The economic and security impact on Rome was immediate and paralyzing. The sudden departure of the agricultural and artisan labor force meant the total cessation of food production and commercial transactions, while the military void left the city entirely defenseless against invasion. Faced with the existential threat of societal collapse and foreign conquest, the patricians were forced to immediate negotiations. The resolution of the First Secession resulted in a monumental political concession: the creation of the office of the tribune of the plebs. These tribunes were drawn exclusively from the plebeian class and were charged with a single mandate: protecting commoners against the arbitrary power and physical abuses of patrician magistrates. Crucially, the person of the tribune was declared legally sacrosanct. Any physical harm or interference inflicted upon a tribune was an offense against the gods, punishable by death. Furthermore, the tribunes were granted the extraordinary power of veto or intercessio over legislative and executive actions, providing the plebeians with a vital defensive mechanism within the rigid machinery of the Roman state. The struggle for economic justice and legal transparency, however, was far from resolved. In 449 BCE, the second secession of the plebs was triggered by the tyrannical behavior of the decemviri, a commission of 10 patrician men appointed to codify Roman law and temporarily granted absolute, unappealable power. When one of the leading decemvirs, Appius Claudius Crassus, corruptly attempted to legally enslave a freeborn plebeian girl named Virginia, leading her desperate father, a centurion named Lucius Virginius, to publicly kill her to protect her virtue and freedom, riots erupted across the city and quickly spread to the army camps. The plebeians once again withdrew from the city, eventually gathering at the Mons Sacer. This second massive strike forced the immediate resignation of the decemvirs and led to the formal publication of the Law of the 12 Tables. While the 12 Tables codified incredibly harsh debt laws, they also represented a major victory for transparency. The laws of Rome were no longer the exclusive, secret domain of the patrician pontiffs, vastly reducing the elite's ability to arbitrarily manipulate unwritten legal traditions against the poor and uneducated. The continuous grinding friction between the patricians' drive for endless capital accumulation and the plebeians' desperate demand for economic survival eventually forced a series of structural legislative compromises. By the 4th century BCE, the political landscape required a massive recalibration to ensure the domestic stability necessary for Rome's continued aggressive expansion across the Italian peninsula. The first major pivot in early Roman political economy was the passage of the Lex Licinia Sextia, the Licinio-Sextian Rogations, in 367 BCE. Promulgated by the plebeian tribunes Gaius Licinius Stolo and Lucius Sextius Lateranus, these sweeping laws directly targeted the twin crises of land monopolization and usurious debt. The Lex de Modo Agrorum provision explicitly restricted individual ownership of the Ager Publicus to a maximum of 500 jugera, approximately 300 acres. Furthermore, it strictly limited the number of livestock, specifically capping cattle at 100 head, that any single individual was legally permitted to graze on public lands. The undeniable intent of this legislation was to halt the aggressive enclosure of the commons by the patricians, thereby preserving essential agricultural resources and pasturage for poor farmers to sustain their subsistence livelihoods. Concurrently, the Lex de Aere Alieno provision offered immediate, albeit temporary, relief for massively indebted plebeians. The law mandated that any interest already paid on an outstanding debt must be deducted directly from the principal loan amount, with the remaining balance to be paid off in 3 equal, manageable annual installments. While modern historians note that wealthy landowners frequently evaded the 500 jugera limit, Ironically, Gaius Licinius himself was reportedly fined later in life for breaking his own law by registering surplus land under his son's name. The Lex Licinia Sextia nonetheless represented the first major systemic attempt by the state to impose regulatory limits on the primitive accumulation of land. Equally critical to the socio-economic survival of the Republic was the eventual abolition of the Nexum system. According to the historical tradition preserved by Livy, the breaking point occurred in the late 4th century, around 326 BCE, though some antiquarian sources suggest 313 BCE, due to the severe sexual and physical abuse of a young plebeian named Gaius Publilius. Publilius had surrendered himself into debt bondage to satisfy his deceased father's overwhelming financial obligations. When he bravely refused the illicit sexual advances of his patrician creditor, Lucius Papirius, he was brutally stripped and flogged. Escaping into the streets and showing his bleeding back to the public, the resulting outrage prompted the immediate passage of the Lex Poetelia Papiria. This landmark legislation fundamentally altered Roman contract law and human rights. It decreed that no citizen could be kept in chains, shackled, or imprisoned in private ergastula for debt, effectively abolishing Nexum as a contractual form. This law shifted the entire legal paradigm of collateral. Henceforth, a debtor's financial property, bona, rather than their physical body, corpus, would serve as the sole security for borrowed capital. The abolition of Nexum preserved the physical liberty of the citizen soldier, ensuring that the Roman military apparatus would not be hollowed out from within by domestic enslavement, and forcing the elite to rely increasingly on the importation of foreign slaves captured in war to work their growing estates. The culmination of this era of deep political economic reform was the Lex Hortensia of 287 BCE. Following a final massive secession to the Janiculum Hill, sparked primarily by rural plebeians crushed by post-war debt and demanding the fair distribution of lands conquered during the Third Samnite War, the dictator Quintus Hortensius brokered a permanent constitutional compromise. The Lex Hortensia officially eliminated the requirement for the patrician senate to ratify or give prior approval to plebiscites, plebiscita. From that point forward, all resolutions passed by the plebeian council became legally binding upon all Roman citizens, including the highest patricians. Politically, this law officially ended the conflict of the orders by establishing theoretical equality before the law. However, the economic reality remained starkly different. The abolition of formal political barriers allowed the wealthiest plebeians to merge seamlessly with the patricians, forming a new, incredibly powerful patricio-plebeian nobility, nobilitas, that continued to dominate the agrarian economy, while the poorer rural plebeians remained highly vulnerable to the underlying systemic pressures of land consolidation. As the Roman state slowly stabilized its internal political structures and integrated its citizen body, it simultaneously embarked on highly ambitious state-funded infrastructure projects that would forever alter the economic geography of the Italian peninsula. The transition from an isolated agricultural economy to a regional powerhouse required advanced logistical networks capable of moving massive armies, securing vital natural resources, and facilitating long-distance trade. One of the earliest and most vital economic arteries of the ancient peninsula was the Via Salaria, or the Salt Road. Salt was an absolutely indispensable commodity in the ancient world, functioning not merely as a biological dietary requirement and the primary means of food preservation, but also as a sacred substance in religious rites, a treatment for wounds, and an instrument of high-value economic exchange. The Via Salaria connected Rome with the vast salt pans of the Adriatic coast to the east and the mouth of the Tiber River at Ostia to the west. The control of this trade route was so critical to the state's economic security and public health that Rome eventually established a near monopoly on salt production in 506 BCE, taking over the industry to prevent aggressive price gouging by coastal merchants. The distribution of special salt rations to early Roman soldiers, known as salarium argentum, the etymological root of the modern word salary, powerfully underscores the deep integration of this specific commodity into the military economic fabric of the Republic. The year 312 BCE marked a watershed moment for Roman engineering, military logistics, and economic expansion, with the simultaneous construction of the Via Appia and the Aqua Appia, both spearheaded by the visionary censor Appius Claudius Caecus. The Via Appia, subsequently hailed as the Queen of Roads, was initially constructed with a strictly military objective: to facilitate the rapid southward deployment of Roman legions during the brutal Samnite Wars. Spanning over 300 miles and eventually reaching the vital port city of Brindisi, the road was a marvel of durability, built with deep foundational trenches, layered gravel, and large interlocking stone slabs crowned in the center for optimal drainage. While military logistics drove its creation, the long-term economic impact of the Via Appia was incredibly transformative. It effectively broke the geographical isolation of Rome, permanently integrating the highly fertile agricultural plains of Campania and the rich, sophisticated markets of Magna Graecia with the capital. The highway enabled the efficient, high-volume transportation of vital agricultural commodities, primarily grain, olive oil, and wine, from rural estates directly into the urban center. This massive reduction in travel time and transportation costs stimulated the growth of new trade hubs along the route and allowed merchants to aggregate wealth on a previously impossible scale. Concurrently, the construction of the Aqua Appia initiated the capacity for large-scale urbanization in Rome. Running mostly underground for 10 miles to maintain a precise gradient, this pioneering aqueduct utilized gravitational flow to transport fresh water from nearby springs directly into the heart of the city. By breaking the city's total reliance on the polluted Tiber River and shallow local wells, the Aqua Appia allowed Rome to safely sustain a rapidly expanding population without succumbing to constant plagues. The reliable provision of clean water fostered the development of public baths, latrines, and fountains, profoundly improving public health and civic sanitation. The aqueduct system operated on a highly organized principle of constant supply, intelligently dividing water at a distribution hub, Castellum Divisorium, into 3 primary pipes, one for public baths, one for the private estates of the wealthy, and one for public drinking fountains. Crucially, the system was engineered so that public fountains received top priority during shortages, ensuring access for the poor and maintaining civic stability. Together, the road and water networks, constructed in the late 4th century BCE, laid the physical groundwork for a complex, highly populated, urbanized market economy. The ultimate culmination of Rome's early economic development was the transition from a localized bartering and proto-currency system to a fully monetized, standardized economy. As Rome's territorial footprint expanded southward along the Via Appia, the Republic increasingly interacted with the highly monetized, sophisticated, and commercially aggressive economies of the Greek colonies in southern Italy, Magna Graecia. The immense logistical requirements of maintaining large, professionalized armies far from home, coupled with the need to engage in complex inter-regional trade, rendered the archaic es rude and the barter of livestock entirely obsolete. The first step in this vital monetary evolution was the standardizing of bronze. Around 300 BCE, the Romans began casting es signatum, signed bronze, which were heavy rectangular ingots featuring predetermined shapes and standardized weights. These ingots were often stamped with powerful state propaganda imagery, such as bulls, eagles, tridents, or naval motifs, symbolizing Rome's growing power. While a significant improvement over weighing raw metal, these massive ingots remained far too cumbersome for daily commerce or the efficient distribution of military payrolls. The true structural shift toward a highly functional coin-based economy occurred during the intense pressures of the Pyrrhic War, 280 to 275 BCE. To facilitate the rapid payment of troops and manage the complex logistics of a major conflict against a Hellenistic king, Rome introduced the es grave system. These were standardized cast circular coins based directly on the Roman pound, libra, with the primary denomination being the as, heavily subdivided into smaller fractions like the uncia. This established a reliable, uniform domestic value standard. Simultaneously, recognizing the absolute necessity to engage fluidly with international markets and pay for foreign mercenaries or supplies, Rome authorized the production of its first silver coinage. Struck in the Greek style rather than cast like the heavy bronze, these early silver didrachms were produced shortly after 280 BCE. Featuring the helmeted head of Mars on the obverse and the proud inscription Romano on the reverse, these coins were designed explicitly to interface seamlessly with the established currency systems of the broader Mediterranean world. The introduction of standardized high-value currency had a profound multiplier effect on the Roman economy. Coins eliminated the massive friction of bartering and the sheer inefficiency of weighing metal, drastically lowering transaction costs across the board. Silver currency allowed wealth to be accumulated, hidden, transported, and deployed with unprecedented ease, encouraging long-distance trade, the rapid mobilization of state resources, and the efficient taxation of conquered peoples. By the middle of the 3rd century BCE, the monetization of the Roman economy effectively linked the agrarian hinterlands of central Italy to the bustling maritime trade networks of the broader Mediterranean world. The Punic Wars, a series of 3 apocalyptic conflicts fought between Rome and Carthage from 264 BCE to 146 BCE, catalyzed Rome's integration into the broader Mediterranean economic system. This era marked a definitive transition from a largely agrarian, localized exchange network into a highly monetized imperial economy driven by the extraction of raw wealth. The sheer scale of wealth extraction during and after these conflicts was entirely unprecedented in the ancient world. Following the conclusion of the First Punic War, the defeated Carthaginian Empire was forced to pay massive war indemnities to Rome, initially set at 3,200 talents of silver, a punitive extraction specifically intended to cripple the Carthaginian war machine and prevent future maritime challenges. However, isotopic analysis of pre-reform Roman silver coins indicates that these early indemnities were actually minted directly from Spanish metal supplied by Carthage, effectively transferring the vast mineral wealth of the Iberian Peninsula straight into the Roman treasury. The financial dynamics of the Second Punic War, famously defined by Hannibal's devastating invasion of Italy, further accelerated Rome's rapid economic metamorphosis. The monumental cost of maintaining multiple legions in the field, estimated at over 2 tons of silver annually for a single legion, placed a severe and unprecedented strain on the Agrarium, the Roman state treasury housed beneath the Temple of Saturn. To manage the massive surges in war booty flowing in from the front lines and to block the catastrophic inflationary pressures caused by plundered wealth, the Roman state enacted a sweeping, permanent monetary reform in 211 BCE. This reform established the denarius, a standardized silver coin that would serve as the economic lifeblood of the empire for centuries to come. The denarius allowed Rome to centralize its currency system and seamlessly accommodate the vast influx of precious metals violently looted from conquered and defecting territories, most notably the wealthy cities of Syracuse and Capua. Following their ultimate defeat in the Second Punic War at the hands of Scipio Africanus in 201 BCE, the Carthaginians faced even harsher economic subjugation. They were stripped of their war elephants, their fleet was reduced to a mere 10 ships, and they were forced to pay a staggering indemnity of 10,000 talents over a period of 50 years. The sheer crushing magnitude of this debt is difficult to comprehend in modern terms. A single talent required the equivalent of 6,000 days of labor for an average worker to offset, meaning the total indemnity represented 60 million days of labor. It was an astronomical sum designed by the Roman Senate to permanently suppress Carthaginian economic recovery and keep the African city in a state of perpetual subservience. Yet Carthage demonstrated a remarkable and terrifying economic resilience. Geological and archaeological evidence extracted from deep sediment cores in the Magerda Delta around the ancient city of Utica reveals that Carthage, stripped of its overseas territories, turned inward and dramatically intensified its exploitation of domestic lead-silver mining in North Africa. This localized, highly efficient extraction of mineral resources enabled the Carthaginians to pay off their monumental 10,000 talent indemnity entirely within just 10 years, 40 years ahead of the Roman schedule. This spectacular economic rebound deeply shocked and terrified the Roman Senate. It inadvertently provided the justification for the hawkish factions in Rome, led by figures like Cato the Elder, to instigate the Third Punic War, culminating in the total and uncompromising physical destruction of Carthage in 146 BCE. The lucrative model of extracting extreme wealth via forced indemnities and direct military plunder was quickly replicated across the eastern Mediterranean as Roman legions marched into Greece and Asia Minor. Following the decisive defeat of the Seleucid king Antiochus III at the Battle of Magnesia, the subsequent Treaty of Apamea in 188 BCE imposed a devastating financial penalty of 15,000 talents of silver on the Seleucid Empire, alongside massive grain requisitions. This staggering sum, greater than the entire annual revenue of the Roman Empire in later generations, systematically drained the Seleucid treasury, crippled their military capabilities, and permanently redirected the vast accumulated wealth of Asia Minor into the heart of Italy. The wealth flowing into the Aerarium Saturni was so incredibly immense that by 167 BCE, following the defeat of the Kingdom of Macedon, Roman citizens living in Italy were entirely exempted from direct taxation, known as the tributum, a highly popular privilege that would last for over a century. The sudden physical expansion of Roman territory outside of the Italian peninsula necessitated a radical evolution in the Republic's administrative and fiscal policies. With the formal acquisition of Sicily and Sardinia following the First Punic War, Rome established its very first overseas provinces, forcing the Senate to grapple with the complexities of governing and taxing non-Italian subjects. Rather than imposing entirely new, untested economic structures, the pragmatism of the Roman Republic led them to adopt and slightly modify the existing tax frameworks of the conquered territories. In the highly fertile province of Sicily, the Romans absorbed the lex hieronica, a sophisticated taxation system previously utilized by King Hieron II of Syracuse, as well as the administrative structures previously employed by the Carthaginians on the western half of the island. This system revolved around the concept of the decuma, an agricultural tithe that exacted exactly 1/10 of the total grain harvest and 1/5 of the fruit harvest from the provincial population. The transition of Sicily and later Sardinia and North Africa into the primary breadbaskets of the Republic fundamentally altered Mediterranean trade logistics. Massive quantities of grain were required to feed the rapidly burgeoning metropolis of Rome. Carthage alone, as part of its post-war obligations, and later as a Roman province, supplied hundreds of thousands of modii of wheat and barley to the capital. To manage the collection, storage, and transportation of these immense agricultural revenues, the Roman state, which pointedly lacked a formal bureaucratic civil service or a dedicated ministry of finance, chose to outsource the collection of the tithe to private civilian contractors. This decision laid the foundation for a profound and ultimately destructive restructuring of the Roman political economy. The decuma tithe system was not merely a mechanism for generating state revenue. It rapidly evolved into an instrument of profound economic extraction and abuse. The Roman state would stipulate a fixed amount of revenue required from a specific region, and the rights to collect these taxes were auctioned in Rome by the censors to the highest private bidder. While the system proved highly efficient for the Roman treasury, guaranteeing a predictable influx of cash and grain without the overhead of maintaining a bureaucracy, it structurally incentivized severe over-extraction. The private contractors were permitted to keep whatever surplus they collected above the state's requirement, leading to widespread and often violent exploitation of the provincial populations. Furthermore, as the Republic continued its eastward expansion into regions like Bithynia, Pontus, and Syria under commanders like Pompey the Great, the decuma and similar tribute systems were systematically implemented across the board. This transformed previously independent, thriving Hellenistic economies into tributary satellites, their agricultural and commercial outputs redesigned solely to sustain the insatiable demands of the Roman core. While the provinces were being drained to enrich the Roman treasury, the most devastating domestic consequence of Rome's imperial expansion was unfolding in the Italian countryside: the systemic displacement of the free Roman peasant class and the subsequent rise of the Latifundia, massive agricultural plantation estates controlled by the senatorial elite. Under the traditional framework of the early and Middle Republic, the Roman legions were not a professional standing army. Instead, they were a citizen militia comprising the assidui, landowning farmers who met a specific property qualification designed to ensure that only men with a vested physical stake in the Republic's survival were permitted to fight for it. Prior to the overseas conquests, military campaigns were generally brief, localized affairs. The legions would march out in the spring and return to their family plots in time for the autumn harvest. However, the acquisition of an overseas empire fundamentally broke this seasonal rhythm. The defense and expansion of the empire required continuous, multi-year deployments in distant, brutal theaters, such as the swamps of Hispania, the mountains of Greece, and the deserts of North Africa. With the male heads of households absent for prolonged, indefinite periods, small family farms fell into severe disrepair. Women, children, and elderly relatives left behind could not physically manage the intensive labor required to keep the farms profitable, leading to insurmountable debt and eventual foreclosure. Upon returning from grueling campaigns, veterans frequently found their ancestral land ruined or already seized by opportunistic creditors. Simultaneously, the wealthy patrician and equestrian classes, flush with the spoils of war, slave trading profits, and lucrative state contracts, aggressively purchased or forcibly enclosed these failing smallholdings. These newly enclosed private lands were then merged with vast, illegally occupied tracts of the Ager Publicus, the state-owned land that had been confiscated from conquered Italian municipalities centuries earlier. This process effectively circumvented ancient Roman laws that placed strict limits on individual land ownership, allowing the elite to amass sprawling estates of unprecedented scale. This rapid consolidation of land ownership was inextricably linked to the massive influx of enslaved war captives, a phenomenon that permanently transformed Rome from a society with slaves into a true industrialized slave society. Roman military conquests produced human chattel on a staggering industrial scale. In 167 BCE, following the decisive victory over the kingdom of Macedon at the Battle of Pydna, the Roman general Aemilius Paulus executed a terrifyingly efficient operation in the region of Epirus. He ordered the systematic, synchronized sack of 70 Epirite cities in a single day, resulting in the enslavement of an estimated 150,000 men, women, and children. Similarly, brutal pacification campaigns in Sardinia yielded so many captives that the phrase Sardinians for sale, sardos venales, became a popular, darkly comic Roman proverb used by figures like Cicero to describe cheap, disposable, and ultimately worthless commodities. The sudden availability of this incredibly cheap, highly economical slave labor fundamentally altered the agricultural economics of the Italian peninsula. The elite owners of the Latifundia entirely replaced the displaced citizen farmers with chain gangs of enslaved people who were often kept in horrific subterranean prisons known as ergastula when not working the fields. From the perspective of the wealthy landowners, slaves were vastly superior to free labor. Because slaves were property, they could not be drafted into the Roman military, representing an uninterrupted, highly profitable labor force that would never be called away to fight in Spain or Africa. Consequently, the entire agricultural focus of the Italian peninsula shifted away from the traditional subsistence farming of grain. Recognizing that basic grain could now be imported cheaply and reliably from the newly acquired provinces of Sicily, Sardinia, and North Africa, the Latifundia owners pivoted toward the industrial-scale production of highly lucrative cash crops, specifically olive oil and wine, destined for export across the Mediterranean. Archaeological evidence strongly corroborates this dramatic economic shift. The sudden proliferation of the Dressel I amphora, a heavy, sturdy, and specialized ceramic vessel used primarily for transporting Italian wine, demonstrates the rise of a massive exportation economy originating from the western coast of Italy, specifically the regions of Etruria and Campania, beginning in the middle of the 2nd century BCE. These massive estates operated with economies of scale that the few remaining independent smallholders could not possibly match, forcing the last vestiges of the free peasantry to sell their land and abandon their traditional livelihoods. Destitute, angry, and stripped of their traditional livelihoods, these landless citizens migrated en masse to the urban center of Rome. There, they swelled the city's population, creating a volatile, politically explosive, and deeply impoverished urban proletariat that would soon become entirely dependent on state subsidies for survival. The administrative vacuum created by the rapidly expanding empire provided a fertile, highly lucrative environment for the rise of the Equites, or the equestrian order, as Rome's dominant entrepreneurial and commercial class. Because traditional Roman cultural norms and formal legislation strictly prohibited the senatorial elite from engaging in overt commercial enterprises, bidding on state contracts, or owning large maritime trading vessels, the immense financial opportunities generated by imperial expansion fell almost entirely to the equestrians. To handle the gargantuan logistical, financial, and infrastructural demands of the Republic, these ambitious businessmen formed the Societates Publicanorum. These were highly sophisticated private syndicates that functioned as the ancient precursors to modern joint stock and limited liability corporations. The Publicani, as the members of these syndicates were known, operated by participating in massive state auctions managed by the censors in the Roman Forum. Here, they bid on contracts to perform public works, construct roads and temples, supplied the distant legions with food and weapons, operate state-owned mines, and, most infamously, collect provincial taxes. These syndicates featured a remarkably complex corporate hierarchy designed to maximize profit while minimizing risk. The Monceps acted as the lead bidder and executive director of the syndicate. The Prides provided the massive amounts of necessary financial collateral, and the Socii acted as general partners, while individual shareholders, known as participes, bought and sold shares in the venture. Intriguingly, To circumvent the severe consequences of personal liability, which under harsh Roman law could result in total asset confiscation or even enslavement for unpaid debts, the equestrian investors frequently utilized a legal loophole involving the concept of the peculium. They placed jointly owned, highly educated slaves in the role of chief executive officer to manage the daily operations of the syndicate. Because slaves were legally considered property and were responsible only for their own specific operating funds, this mechanism completely insulated the wealthy patrician and equestrian investors from catastrophic personal losses if a commercial venture failed or a ship sank. The extraction of provincial mineral wealth was one of the primary avenues of extreme equestrian enrichment. For example, the Roman acquisition of the Iberian Peninsula brought the vast Rio Tinto mining complex under the direct control of the Publicani. Implementing highly advanced engineering techniques, such as stacking up to 16 massive wooden water wheels to continuously drain deep subterranean shafts, the Publicani orchestrated the extraction of millions of tons of silver and copper ore. This immense operation was entirely reliant on the brutal, unrelenting exploitation of slave labor in toxic, lightless, and highly dangerous conditions. Yet, despite the human cost and the creation of some of the earliest recorded examples of global environmental pollution, the operation succeeded in supplying the Roman mints with an uninterrupted stream of bullion to finance further conquests. However, the most notorious, hated, and politically destabilizing aspect of the Publicani was their role as tax farmers, a role that reached its apex following the annexation of the Kingdom of Pergamum, which became the incredibly wealthy Roman province of Asia in 133 BCE. The Publicani would pay the Roman treasury the required provincial tax amount up front in a single lump sum, treating the payment as a high-interest loan to the state. They were then granted the absolute legal authority to extract that sum, plus whatever exorbitant profit margin they could aggressively squeeze from the local population directly from the province. Supported by their own private bureaucratic staffs and often backed by the threat of Roman military force, the Publicani systematically stripped the province of Asia of its wealth. They aggressively assessed lands, levied impossible tolls, and drove once prosperous allied cities into crippling, inescapable debt to Roman financiers. This complete privatization of public revenue created profound constitutional and political crises back in Rome. To protect their incredibly lucrative provincial monopolies, the equestrians aggressively leveraged their immense financial wealth to influence Roman politics and legislation. In 122 BCE, the populist tribune Gaius Gracchus passed the Lex Sempronia Judiciaria, a law that transferred control of the permanent extortion courts, the Quaestio de Reputundis, away from the senators and handed it directly to the equestrians. While originally intended to check senatorial corruption, this legislative shift produced an inherently corrupt and paradoxical judicial paradigm. Roman provincial governors who genuinely attempted to protect their provincial populations from the predatory, illegal practices of the Publicani suddenly found themselves facing fabricated charges of extortion in courts manned entirely by the very equestrians they were trying to regulate. The most egregious and historically significant example of this judicial weaponization occurred during the trial of Publius Rutilius Rufus in 92 BCE. Rufus, a highly respected former consul and a man renowned throughout the Republic for his strict Stoic morality, had served as a senior administrator in the province of Asia. During his tenure, he actively and successfully restrained the Publicani from illegally extorting the local Greek populations. In swift retaliation, the equestrian-controlled courts in Rome prosecuted and convicted Rufus of extortion in a blatant sham trial with a preordained verdict. This event was so shocking that Cicero later cited it as a catastrophic miscarriage of justice and the darkest stain on Roman legal history. Displaying his characteristic stoicism, Rufus calmly accepted a sentence of exile rather than beg for mercy. Tellingly, he relocated to Smyrna, the very Asian city he had just been convicted of extorting, where he was welcomed as a conquering hero and a savior by the grateful provincial victims. Conversely, corrupt governors who colluded with the Publicani to loot their provinces, such as the infamous Gaius Bayerus in Sicily, were often fiercely protected by these same corrupt equestrian networks, operating with total impunity until occasionally exposed by highly skilled, independent orators like Cicero. This fundamental structural misalignment of incentives fatally eroded the moral and administrative authority of the Republic, demonstrating to the world that Roman law existed only to facilitate organized theft. By the middle of the 2nd century BCE, the convergence of these destructive economic vectors, the loss of the free peasantry, the unchecked expansion of the Latifundia, the massive influx of slaves, and the extreme concentration of wealth in the hands of the Publicani and senators, culminated in a severe demographic and military crisis that threatened the very survival of the state. Because military service in the Roman legions was strictly contingent upon a property qualification determined during the census, the widespread dispossession of the rural smallholders resulted in a rapidly shrinking pool of eligible military recruits. The demographic data from the period painted a bleak picture for Roman strategists. Historical census figures, which tracked the number of adult male citizens capable of bearing arms, showed alarming stagnation and decline. While the censors recorded a robust 337,022 adult male citizens in 164 BCE, the peak of demographic recovery following the Second Punic War, that number had dropped to 317,933 by 136 BCE, and hovered at 318,823 in 131 BCE. The perception among the Roman political class was that the Republic was facing a catastrophic decline in military manpower, a phenomenon referred to by ancient historians as dysandria, precisely when its imperial borders and defensive obligations were expanding faster than ever. The traditional recruitment pools were drying up, replaced by massive slave plantations that contributed nothing to the state's military defense. Recognizing that the military survival of the state depended entirely on a robust, land-owning citizenry, a young, idealistic, and highly ambitious politician named Tiberius Sempronius Gracchus utilized his position as tribune of the plebs in 133 BCE to propose a radical solution, the Lex Sempronia Agraria. This sweeping agrarian reform legislation sought to strictly enforce an ancient, largely ignored law that limited the occupation of the Ager Publicus, public land, to 500 jugera per citizen, with an additional allowance of 250 jugera for each child, up to a maximum of 1,000 jugera. Under Tiberius's proposal, the Roman state would explicitly confiscate any public land held by the elite in excess of this legal limit. In exchange, the wealthy occupiers would receive clear privatized title to the 500 jugera they were allowed to keep. The confiscated surplus land would then be redistributed in small inalienable allotments, subject to a nominal tax, vectigal, to the landless urban and rural poor. The dual objective of the Lex Sempronia Agraria was brilliantly pragmatic: to alleviate the explosive poverty and overcrowding within the capital city by moving the poor back to the countryside, and, more importantly, to artificially regenerate the class of propertied citizens, assidui, eligible for military conscription. However, the political execution of the law proved fatal. Anticipating the predictable and ferocious opposition of the Senate, whose members were the primary beneficiaries of the illegal land enclosures and the operators of the Latifundia, Tiberius bypassed the Senate entirely, and took his legislation directly to the plebeian assembly for a vote. Furthermore, when the Senate attempted to starve the newly created Agrarian Commission, the Triumviri Agris Judicandis Assignandis of funding, Tiberius proposed using the massive royal treasury recently bequeathed to Rome by King Attalus III of Pergamum to finance the land surveys and distributions. This act directly usurped the Senate's ancient unwritten prerogative over state finances and foreign affairs. Although the Agrarian Commission was incredibly successful on a practical level, surveying and distributing millions of jugera of land, archaeologically attested by surviving stone boundary markers across southern Italy, and causing a massive spike in the census numbers by 125 BCE to 394,736 citizens, the political fallout destroyed the Republic's norms. The senatorial elite, viewing Tiberius's circumvention of traditional checks and balances as a populist descent into tyranny, orchestrated his brutal assassination in the streets of Rome. By murdering a sacrosanct tribune, the Senate introduced deadly political violence into the Republic, irreversibly shattering the consensus-driven nature of Roman governance and signaling that political disputes would henceforth be settled by force. Despite the valiant efforts and physical successes of the Gracchan land commissions, the underlying macroeconomic realities of the Latifundia and the profitability of slave labor proved too powerful to permanently reverse. By the final decade of the 2nd century BCE, Rome faced simultaneous existential military disasters. The legions suffered humiliating defeats against King Jugurtha in the deserts of North Africa, while simultaneously facing the terrifying mass migration of the Cimbri and Teutones, Germanic tribes that completely annihilated multiple Roman armies in the north. These dual threats stretched the traditional property-based levy system far past its breaking point. In 107 BCE, facing a critical and immediate shortage of propertied soldiers to combat Jugurtha, the newly elected consul Gaius Marius implemented a series of pragmatic, emergency tactical changes that would ultimately seal the fate of the Republic. These changes became known to history as the Marian Reforms. Marius officially abolished the ancient property requirement for military service. He bypassed the complex census classes entirely and opened recruitment directly to volunteers from the capite censi, the head count or the vast mass of the landless urban and rural proletariat who possessed no property other than their own lives. This process of proletarianization fundamentally and permanently transformed the nature of the Roman legions. They transitioned from a temporary, seasonal citizen militia fighting out of civic duty to protect their own farms, into a standing army of semi-professional soldiers fighting primarily for economic survival and social mobility. Because these destitute new recruits possessed no farms to return to after the campaign, they relied entirely on the military as a lifelong career. They expected to be rewarded with plunder during their active service, and crucially with land grants upon their eventual retirement. The political implications of this shift were catastrophic for the stability of the state. The Roman Senate, entrenched in conservative tradition and fiercely protective of public land, repeatedly refused to take institutional responsibility for providing land to these retiring, propertyless veterans. Consequently, the soldiers' loyalties transferred rapidly from the abstract, unhelpful concept of the Roman Republic to their specific, charismatic generals who possessed the political capital and ruthlessness required to secure their retirement benefits by force. By linking the economic destiny of the armed rural poor directly to the political and military success of individual warlords, Marius inadvertently laid the groundwork for the private armies that would dominate the late Republic. It was this exact fatal structural flaw that allowed ambitious commanders like Lucius Cornelius Sulla, Pompey the Great, and ultimately Julius Caesar to turn their battle-hardened legions against the state itself. They utilized troops who valued the financial patronage of their general far more than the authority of a hostile, unresponsive Senate. Concurrently, The political exploitation of the massive, displaced urban population within the city of Rome evolved into a defining feature of the late Republic. Realizing that the agrarian crisis could not be entirely solved by land distribution alone, Gaius Gracchus, the younger brother of the assassinated Tiberius, initiated a broader, more comprehensive reform agenda during his own explosive tribunate in 123 BCE. Among his most consequential and long-lasting policies was the Lex Sempronia Frumentaria, the first legal provision in Roman history ensuring a regular, state-subsidized grain supply for the urban poor. Under this revolutionary law, every male Roman citizen was entitled to apply in person to purchase a monthly ration of 5 modi of grain, approximately 35 kilograms, at a fixed below-market price of 6 1/3 asses per modius. While the grain was not entirely free, this system effectively insulated the massive urban proletariat from the extreme seasonal price volatility and artificial scarcities often engineered by greedy grain merchants and speculators. The physical and logistical demands of this new welfare program required the Roman state to deeply and permanently integrate itself into the Mediterranean shipping network. Massive cargo ships known as corbitae, featuring broad beams and deep rounded hulls, capable of carrying between 250 to 400 tons of bulk grain, constantly navigated the dangerous maritime routes from Alexandria and Carthage directly to the Italian ports of Ostia and Puteoli. The journey from Egypt could take 2 to 3 weeks, while ships from Carthage could arrive in a mere 3 to 5 days. To store the colossal volume of imported wheat necessary to prevent famine and riots in the capital, enormous, highly secure warehouse complexes were constructed across Rome, the most famous being the Horea Galbae. Located strategically near the Tiber River and the waste dump of Monte Testaccio, the Horea Galbae was an architectural marvel of logistical storage. It featured 140 individual storage rooms on the ground floor alone, arranged around 3 long courtyards, and spanned an incredible 225,000 square feet. It became the physical epicenter of the Roman food supply, storing not only the public grain, a nona publica, but also vast quantities of imported olive oil, wine, and clothing. Over the subsequent decades, the subsidized grain dole transitioned from a necessary economic relief measure into a highly potent political weapon. It was utilized heavily by populist politicians, the populares, to secure the absolute loyalty and physical intimidation power of the urban mobs in the voting assemblies. In 58 BCE, the radical patrician-turned-plebeian tribune Clodius Pulcher escalated this dynamic to its ultimate logical conclusion by passing the Lex Clodia Frumentaria. This law eliminated the subsidized price entirely, directing the state to distribute the monthly grain ration to Roman citizens completely free of charge. This monumental act effectively cemented the permanent welfare state into the political framework of Rome. By the mid-1st century BCE, an estimated 320,000 citizens, representing nearly 30% of the entire population of the city of Rome, were entirely and unconditionally dependent on the state for their daily sustenance. Providing this free food became a massive fiscal burden, consuming roughly 20% of all government expenditure and permanently draining the treasury. The dire political necessity of feeding this enormous, largely non-productive urban underclass locked the Republic into a perpetual, unbreakable cycle of imperial expansion. The continuous pacification of the capital required the relentless, unyielding extraction of resources from Egypt, North Africa, and Sicily, tying the survival of the politicians in Rome directly to the suffering of the provinces. Spanning roughly 2 centuries from the ascent of Caesar Augustus in 27 BCE to the assassination of Severus Alexander in 235 CE, the Pax Romana period is broadly identified as the Golden Age of the Roman Empire. Emerging from the ashes of the Roman Republic's catastrophic and protracted civil wars, the new imperial system, known as the Principate, established a hegemonic stability that facilitated unprecedented demographic expansion. At its zenith, the Roman Empire's population peaked at an estimated 70 million inhabitants, accounting for roughly 1/3 of the entire global population at the time. The political economy of the era, which was characterized by a dramatic transition from the predatory wealth extraction models of the late Republic to a sophisticated, integrated, and highly monetized imperial system. By unifying the entire Mediterranean basin under a single political authority, the Roman state inadvertently laid the necessary structural groundwork for the peak of pre-industrial economic growth. To sustain an empire of this unprecedented scale, the Roman state required an immense logistical and financial apparatus. The resulting political economy was a complex, delicate balancing act between state-directed logistics, massive market integration, and the astronomical expenditures required to maintain a permanent professional military. Through strategic fiscal reforms, the promotion of a massive free trade zone, and the utilization of organized merchant guilds, the Principate achieved a level of economic sophistication that would not be replicated in Europe until the dawn of the early modern period. However, this magnificent economic engine was ultimately bound by severe structural limitations. The reliance on human and animal labor, an enduring and unmanageable trade deficit with the East, and the insurmountable, ever-growing costs of maintaining a professional standing army introduced systemic vulnerabilities into the imperial framework. These vulnerabilities, which were initially masked by the immense prosperity and expansion of the High Empire, eventually forced the state into destructive cycles of currency debasement. This monetary manipulation would slowly erode the economic foundations of the state, culminating in the severe economic unraveling known to historians as the crisis of the 3rd century. The foundation of the Principate's economic success was meticulously laid by the comprehensive reforms of its first emperor, Augustus. Following his decisive victory over Mark Antony and Cleopatra at the Battle of Actium in 31 BCE, Augustus faced the monumental task of transitioning Rome from a fractured, volatile republic into a cohesive, enduring empire. This ambitious undertaking required a total restructuring of the state's fiscal architecture to ensure that revenues could reliably fund a massive professional army and an expansive urban infrastructure without triggering provincial revolts that had consistently plagued the republic. Augustus understood that political stability could only be achieved through financial predictability, and he set about dismantling the chaotic financial institutions of the past. A primary and highly consequential structural change was the reorganization of the state treasuries. During the era of the Roman Republic, the Senate controlled the central state treasury known as the Agrarium, which was housed securely in the Temple of Saturn and managed by elected magistrates known as praetors. While Augustus outwardly maintained the illusion of republican continuity by leaving the common Agrarium under senatorial control to fund jurisdictions within the older established territories, he simultaneously created a new parallel financial institution, the fiscus. The fiscus initially served to absorb the colossal wealth seized from the conquest of Egypt, but it rapidly expanded into the central imperial treasury, collecting vast revenues from the resource-rich frontier provinces that were governed directly by the emperor and his appointed legates. Because the fiscus acted essentially as the emperor's private financial vehicle, it granted the executive branch unhindered capital allocation power, free from the endless debates and political maneuvering of the Senate. This dual treasury system allowed Augustus to bypass senatorial financial bottlenecks while independently directing vast sums of capital toward imperial building projects, military expenditures, and the vital grain supply. Furthermore, to secure the loyalty of the armed forces, Augustus established a third distinct treasury, the Aerarium Militare. Funded by a newly imposed 5% inheritance tax and a dedicated sales tax on auctions, this pension-like treasury was strictly ring-fenced to provide land and cash payouts to retiring military veterans, thereby guaranteeing their loyalty directly to the emperor rather than to individual ambitious generals. Equally transformative to the stability of the empire was the Augustan reform of provincial taxation. During the Republic, the state lacked a robust bureaucratic apparatus to collect taxes directly. Instead, tax collection was outsourced to private corporate contractors known as the Publicani. These powerful tax farmers paid the Roman state a fixed sum of money in advance for the right to collect taxes in a specific province, keeping whatever surplus wealth they could extract from the local population. This privatized system suffered from severe principal-agent problems and massive information asymmetries, as the Publicani routinely colluded with corrupt Roman governors to ruthlessly extort provincial populations. This predatory extraction led to widespread economic devastation, stunted agricultural development, and frequent bloody rebellions. Recognizing that long-term prosperity required a healthy tax base, Augustus abolished the state's reliance on the Publicani for direct taxation, replacing them with a highly structured, permanent bureaucracy of salaried imperial census officials and procurators. By instituting a regular empire-wide census, the state could accurately and fairly assess the true value of provincial land and the exact size of the population. This monumental data-gathering effort allowed for the implementation of predictable, standardized, direct taxes, the tributum soli, a property and land tax, and the tributum capitis, a flat poll tax levied on adults. This decisive shift from privatized extortion to rationalized census-based taxation drastically reduced the deadweight loss in the economy, providing the provinces with the long-term stability needed to confidently invest in agricultural improvements and commercial enterprises without the fear of arbitrary confiscation. To lubricate the gears of this newly rationalized economy, Augustus formalized a stable empire-wide monetary system based on a strict bimetallic standard. He established fixed weight standards and intrinsic value ratios for imperial coins, making the gold aureus and the silver denarii the absolute bedrock of Mediterranean commerce. The state mandated a strict valuation ratio, where 1 gold aureus was legally equivalent to exactly 25 silver denarii, a legal ratio that aligned perfectly with the natural 1 to 12.5 value ratio of gold to silver by weight. By monopolizing the minting of high-value precious metal coinage and ensuring its remarkably high purity, with early imperial denarii containing approximately 98% pure silver, Augustus created a highly trusted fiduciary framework. This reliable, universally accepted money supply dramatically lowered transaction costs across the empire. It allowed merchants in disparate and distant regions to price goods predictably, save their profits securely, and engage in complex, long-distance credit agreements without the crippling fear of sudden, unannounced currency devaluation. With a stable currency and a rationalized, predictable tax system firmly in place, the Roman Empire rapidly coalesced into the largest contiguous free trade zone the ancient world had ever seen. The physical geographic reality of the Mediterranean Sea provided a massive, frictionless maritime highway that connected the diverse ecological zones of Europe, North Africa, and the Near East. In the ancient world, traveling by sea was vastly more efficient and estimated to be up to 60 times cheaper than transporting bulk goods over land, where the cost of feeding draft animals quickly eroded profit margins. Recognizing this geographic advantage, the imperial state took decisive, overwhelming military action to secure maritime commercial routes. The Roman navy aggressively and systematically eradicated the endemic piracy that had plagued the Mediterranean during the Hellenistic and late Republican period. With the sea lanes secured by permanent Mediterranean fleets stationed at strategic hubs like Misenum and Ravenna, merchant vessels could operate with unprecedented safety, which drastically lowered maritime insurance premiums and the overall cost of capital for ambitious shipping ventures. The state further stimulated this massive commercial integration through its deliberate tariff policies. Unlike many modern protectionist states, the Roman Empire did not utilize tariffs primarily to protect domestic industries from foreign competition, but rather as a straightforward, highly lucrative revenue generation tool. Crucially, the state distinguished heavily between external trade and internal trade. Goods imported into the empire from external regions, such as India, Parthia, or pre-conquest Britain, were subject to a steep 25% customs tariff upon entry. However, once a territory was fully annexed, pacified, and integrated into the imperial system, trade across provincial boundaries within the empire incurred a remarkably low tariff of only 2.5%. This low barrier to internal trade allowed regions to confidently abandon mere subsistence farming and specialize in the mass production of goods for which they held a comparative geographic or climatic advantage. For instance, the Iberian Peninsula specialized in the mass export of olive oil and precious metals, Gaul in wine and fine pottery, and Egypt and North Africa in the industrial-scale cultivation of wheat. Modern econometric analysis reveals that this secure, low-tariff environment fostered a highly integrated market economy characterized by price convergence. Utilizing historical data on the price of wheat across various provinces, modern economic historians, most notably Peter Temin, have convincingly demonstrated that the Mediterranean effectively functioned as a single, unified market. The price of grain was effectively anchored by the massive, insatiable demand in the city of Rome. Consequently, the price of wheat in any given province systematically decreased the further that province was situated from the capital, reflecting the raw cost of transportation rather than localized market inefficiencies or arbitrary administrative decrees. This specific behavior of prices, moving in random walks and responding organically to supply and demand shocks across vast distances, indicates that the Roman economy was driven primarily by market forces, operating at a level of sophistication comparable to the economies of the 17th century England or the Dutch Republic. Nowhere was the synergy between state logistics and private enterprise more evident or more critical to survival than in the management of the Roman grain supply, known administratively as the Cura Anani. The city of Rome, a hyper-urbanized metropolis of roughly 1 million residents, vastly outstripped the agricultural carrying capacity of the surrounding Italian peninsula. To maintain political stability, prevent devastating urban riots, and feed the vast urban proletariat, the state operated the grain dole, a massive social welfare program providing free or heavily subsidized wheat to hundreds of thousands of qualifying male citizens. Providing this daily staple required the importation of astronomical quantities of food. Following its annexation by Augustus, Egypt alone reliably supplied 135,000 tons of grain annually to Rome, while the island of Sicily contributed an additional 270,000 tons. The sheer scale of this consumption is evidenced by archaeological sites like Monte Testaccio in Ostia, an artificial hill standing 130 feet high, composed entirely of approximately 13 million discarded olive oil amphorae. To manage this logistical leviathan, the Roman state relied heavily on the collegia, professional associations and guilds that operated dynamically throughout the empire. The specific collegia of the naviculari, or ship owners, were absolutely vital to the survival of Rome. Rather than attempting to build, crew, and operate a massive state-owned merchant marine, which would have required prohibitive upfront capital outlays and endless maintenance costs, the Roman government astutely contracted the transport of grain to these private shipping guilds. To incentivize the naviculari to undertake the immense financial and physical risks of transporting bulk grain across the unpredictable Mediterranean Sea, the state offered them lucrative public contracts, comprehensive exemptions from civic duties, broad tax immunities, and in some specific cases, the highly coveted granting of full Roman citizenship. These collegia were not merely sterile economic entities or modern corporations. They functioned as deeply embedded social and religious networks that governed the daily lives of their members. Members shared common cult practices, financed communal banquets, and paid into mutual insurance funds that covered necessary burial expenses and provided a financial safety net against personal misfortune. By organizing the naviculari and other merchants into these robust, self-regulating corporate bodies that possessed legal rights such as habere corpus, the right to own property as an entity, the Roman state effectively minimized its own bureaucratic overhead. The collegia solved the pervasive ancient problem of trust in long-distance trade, as the social and religious cohesion of the guild provided an internal mechanism to enforce contracts and severely penalize fraudulent behavior among merchants. This intricate public-private partnership allowed the empire to successfully operate grain freighters of staggering size, with some massive vessels capable of carrying well over 1,000 tons of cargo, a scale of maritime engineering and logistical capacity that would remain totally unmatched in Europe until the 19th century. Despite its vast logistical achievements, impressive infrastructure, and deep market integration, the Roman economy ultimately hit a hard ceiling of pre-industrial growth. The fundamental constraints on this economic expansion remain a subject of intense historical and economic debate, most notably crystallized in the slavery stagnation hypothesis, originally posited by the influential historian Moses Finley in the mid-20th century. Finley argued forcefully that the ubiquity of cheap enslaved labor throughout the Mediterranean structurally disincentivized the Roman elite from pursuing technological automation and sparking an ancient industrial revolution. According to this theoretical framework, because human labor could be acquired easily and cheaply through military conquest and the massive Mediterranean slave trade, elite capital owners preferred to deploy enslaved people rather than invest capital into researching and developing labor-saving machinery. Consequently, this resulted in a society that was technically stagnant, where the elite were focused more on maintaining social control over their workforce than on pure profit maximization through mechanical efficiency. However, modern archaeological discoveries and rigorous economic analyses have heavily problematized this thesis, revealing a much more nuanced reality regarding Roman technological capability and application. While it is undeniably true that the Romans relied predominantly on human and animal power for the vast majority of their economic output, they were highly capable of deploying advanced machinery when specific demographic or geographic constraints necessitated it. The most striking and undeniable counter-evidence to the stagnation hypothesis is the Barbegal watermill complex located near Arles in southern France. Constructed in the 2nd century CE, the Barbegal site represents the greatest known concentration of mechanical power in the ancient world. The massive industrial complex featured 16 enormous overshot water wheels arranged in parallel cascades descending down a steep hillside, driven by water channeled from a dedicated aqueduct. New innovative isotopic analyses of the calcium carbonate deposits left on the decayed wooden mill elements revealed that the site was highly sophisticated, with components requiring regular maintenance, modification, and replacement over its century of operation. The Barbegal mills were capable of grinding anywhere from 4.5 to 25 tons of flour for a single day, an output sufficient to feed tens of thousands of people. Interestingly, the isotopic data suggests the mills operated seasonally, aligning perfectly with Roman shipping schedules, indicating the complex likely mass-produced non-perishable ship's bread for the vital maritime trade network. The undeniable existence of Barbegal, alongside advanced water-powered stone sawmills found in places like Hierapolis, strongly indicates that the Romans did not lack the intellectual capacity or the willingness to innovate. Rather, the application of technology was dictated by local factor endowments and raw, calculating economic rationality. In regions where human labor was abundant and incredibly cheap, complex machinery was simply not economically viable because the massive upfront capital expenditure of building necessary aqueducts, gears, and maintenance infrastructure heavily outweighed the incremental gains in daily efficiency. Furthermore, Roman technological knowledge was highly siloed within a secretive craft system, where specialized skills were strictly passed from master to apprentice, severely limiting the widespread documentation and cross-pollination of engineering breakthroughs. Therefore, the absolute limits of Roman manufacturing growth were not solely born of a psychological reliance on slavery, but rather derived from the inherent, unavoidable limitations of pre-industrial energy sources and the cold economic calculus of capital investment versus cheap labor costs. Another profound constraint to the long-term sustainability of the Roman economy was its structural trade imbalance with the East. The political consolidation of the empire coincided closely with the opening of direct, highly profitable maritime routes across the Indian Ocean. Greek and Roman navigators operating out of bustling Egyptian Red Sea ports like Myos, Hormos, and Berenice learned to expertly harness the seasonal monsoon winds. This meteorological mastery allowed massive merchant fleets to bypass the arduous, dangerous overland Silk Road and hostile Parthian intermediaries entirely. This facilitated an absolute explosion of maritime trade with the Indian subcontinent and Han China, bringing a massive influx of highly desired luxury commodities such as silk, pearls, and, most importantly, black pepper and exotic spices into the wealthy Mediterranean markets. The classic 1st century CE text, The Periplus of the Erythraean Sea, provides a vivid, detailed account of these bustling trade routes, the specific ports of call, and the diverse goods exchanged. While this booming Eastern trade generated massive, indispensable tariff revenues for the fiscus, with the 25% import tax on Indian goods funding a substantial portion of the entire imperial budget, it also created a deep macroeconomic anxiety regarding the continuous outflow of precious metals. Because the Romans produced very few manufactured goods that the distant eastern markets actually desired, the empire was forced to pay for these high-value luxury imports largely in hard currency. The Roman author Pliny the Elder famously and bitterly lamented this dynamic in his writings, claiming that India, China, and the Arabian Peninsula drained the empire of a staggering 100 million sesterces annually merely to satisfy the decadent, frivolous tastes of Roman elites and their women. Modern historical scholarship often debates whether Pliny's astronomical figures represented a genuine mercantilist trade deficit that threatened the state, or merely a moralizing conservative critique of luxury and the perceived decline of traditional Roman austerity. Archaeological evidence, particularly the discovery of vast hoards of Roman gold and silver coins unearthed along the Indian coast, undeniably confirms that a highly significant volume of specie was indeed leaving the empire on a regular basis. While some contemporary economic historians argue that this outflow was entirely sustainable, given the sheer massive volume of silver continuously mined in provinces like Spain, the persistent annual drain of bullion nonetheless placed immense pressure on the Roman money supply. In a rigid economy completely lacking fiat currency or a central banking system capable of expanding the money supply, the continuous export of physical gold and silver to the East slowly constricted the liquidity available within the domestic Roman market, subtly but continuously weakening the bimetallic standard that underpinned the prosperity of the Pax Romana. The ultimate structural flaw in the political economy of the Principate, and the catalyst for its eventual undoing, was the exorbitant escalating cost of its military apparatus. The Roman standing army, which grew from approximately 250,000 men under Augustus to over 400,000 by the reign of Septimius Severus in the early 3rd century, was the absolute bedrock of imperial power, political legitimacy, and border security. However, this unprecedented professionalization came at a staggering, almost unmanageable fiscal price. In the pre-industrial agrarian economy of Rome, where upwards of 80% of the entire population was engaged in basic subsistence farming, the amount of surplus wealth generated by the economy was highly constrained. the army consumed a vastly disproportionate share of this limited surplus. Modern estimates suggest that army base pay, retirement bonuses, donativa, equipment manufacturing, and logistical support consumed anywhere from 60 to 80% of the entire imperial budget, representing a massive mobilization of the empire's gross domestic product toward pure defense. During the first century of the empire, the immense wealth looted from newly conquered territories and the newfound efficiency of the Augustan census tax system generated enough revenue to temporarily mask this structural deficit. However, as the empire reached its natural geographic limits and ceased its rapid geographic expansion, the lucrative influx of war booty completely dried up. The state was left to fund its colossal, stationary military machine solely through internal taxation. Because the agrarian tax base could not be squeezed indefinitely without causing widespread famine, economic collapse, or violent rebellion, emperors facing budgetary shortfalls or sudden fiscal shocks were left with only one viable, immediate political option: manipulating the currency. The dangerous precedent for this destructive monetary policy was definitively set by Emperor Nero in 64 CE. Following the devastating Great Fire of Rome, Nero faced catastrophic capital requirements to fund the rapid rebuilding of the capital city, alongside the continuous, unrelenting burden of military pay. Unable to raise taxes sufficiently on a traumatized populace, Nero enacted a major reform of the currency, marking the first significant debasement of the silver denarius. He systematically reduced both the physical weight of the denarius and its silver purity, dropping the silver content from the traditional, trusted Augustan standard of roughly 98% down to approximately 93%. Simultaneously, the weight of the gold aureus was slightly reduced to maintain the artificial 25-to-1 exchange ratio dictated by the state. In the immediate short term, this debasement was highly effective from a purely fiscal standpoint. By mixing cheaper base metals, such as copper, into the silver supply, the state could instantly mint a significantly larger volume of coins from the exact same absolute amount of precious metal bullion. This injected immediate, much-needed liquidity into the economy and allowed the fiscus to effortlessly meet its pressing financial obligations to the army and building contractors. However, this action fundamentally and permanently compromised the fiduciary trust that deeply underpinned the Roman monetary system. Nero's debasement established a perilous, irresistible template for future emperors. Whenever the state faced a liquidity crisis, whether due to border wars, devastating plagues, or the simple political necessity of buying the loyalty of the troops with massive cash bonuses, the immediate, easiest response was to further degrade the coinage. Over the subsequent century and a half, the debasement of the denarius accelerated at an alarming rate. Emperor Trajan reduced the silver content to roughly 89% to help fund his massive Dacian campaigns, and by the reign of Marcus Aurelius, the purity had slipped further to 79%. The fiscal situation deteriorated rapidly and visibly under the Servian dynasty at the dawn of the 3rd century. Septimius Severus, having secured the throne through a brutal, resource-draining civil war, aggressively increased military pay to retain the absolute loyalty of the legions. To afford this massive new ongoing expense, he severely slashed the silver content of the denarius to roughly 57%, making the coin barely more than half silver. His successor, Caracalla, pushed the fragile system even further by introducing the Antoninus, a new coin visibly featuring the emperor wearing a radiant crown, ostensibly worth 2 denarii, but containing only 1.5 times the silver of a single denarius, effectively acting as a massive stealth devaluation. Recognizing the desperate need for more revenue, Caracalla also issued the Constitutio Antoninina in 212 CE, expanding Roman citizenship to all free men in the empire, primarily to subject a vast wider swath of the population to specific taxes levied only on citizens, such as the inheritance tax. The illusion of stability finally shattered in 235 CE when the last Severan emperor, the young Severus Alexander, was assassinated by his own mutinous troops. The soldiers were furious at his attempts to negotiate with invading Germanic tribes rather than engaging them in lucrative combat, and they replaced him with a massive, brutal soldier named Maximinus Thrax. This assassination inaugurated a half-century of unremitting military anarchy. Over the ensuing 50 years, the Roman Empire was contested by more than 20 legitimate claimants to the throne, alongside countless regional usurpers who flared up and died in the provinces. This is a staggering rate of turnover, especially compared to the relative stability of the preceding 2.5 centuries, which saw only 26 emperors in total. This relentless political instability triggered what can only be described as a lethal military economic death spiral. The mechanics of this death spiral were brutal and inescapable. The individuals who claimed the purple during this era are known to history as the barracks emperors, because they almost universally rose from the ranks of the military and depended entirely upon the swords of their soldiers to stay in power. Whenever a general was proclaimed emperor by his troops, he was immediately obligated to distribute massive donativa, or accession bonuses, to secure their volatile loyalty. These bonuses were traditionally payable in precious metals, requiring vast, immediate outlays of gold and silver from an already depleted treasury. Furthermore, these new emperors rarely enjoyed a moment of peace. They were forced to engage in constant, grinding civil wars against rival Roman factions who supported different generals. Simultaneously, the empire faced unprecedented external threats. Along the Rhine and Danube rivers, vast confederations of Germanic tribes, including the Goths, Franks, Vandals, and Alemanni, were pushing relentlessly against the frontiers, driven by climate fluctuations, rising sea levels in the Low Countries, and the lure of Roman wealth. In the east, a revitalized and highly aggressive superpower, the Sassanid Persian Empire, repeatedly invaded the wealthy Roman provinces of Syria and Mesopotamia. The Roman state suddenly found itself fighting desperate wars of survival on multiple fronts. To combat these threats, emperors desperately needed to enlarge the army, increasing both the number of troops and the proportion of highly expensive cavalry required to rapidly respond to border incursions. This necessitated a massive increase in the military payroll, alongside surging costs for the logistical transportation of troops and supplies across thousands of miles of contested territory. In previous centuries, the Roman Empire had funded its expansion through conquest, absorbing the wealth, bullion, and slaves of defeated nations. But the empire was no longer expanding, it was fighting purely on the defensive. The essential stream of income from foreign plunder completely dried up. Worse still, the invading armies and the marching Roman legions frequently devastated the internal Roman countryside, destroying the very agricultural and commercial tax base the state relied upon to fund the war effort. Faced with a structural deficit that defied comprehension, lacking the ability to borrow money, and unable to extract enough hard taxation from a war-torn populace, the barracks emperors resorted to the only expedient left to balance the imperial ledger. They seized upon the precedent set by the Severans and engaged in rampant, catastrophic currency debasement. With each succession crisis, each massive accession bonus, and each desperate military campaign, the imperial mints churned out vast quantities of Antoninians with progressively lower silver content, desperately trying to stretch the budget just a little bit further. The physical and macroeconomic realities of this relentless debasement were absolutely devastating. The Antoninius, which had begun at roughly 50% silver purity under Caracalla, plummeted in value over the decades. By the reign of Trebonianus Gallus in 253 CE, the coin was down to about 36% silver. Just 15 years later, during the disastrous reign of Gallienus, 253 to 268 CE, the silver content of the coin had collapsed to barely 2 to 5%. What had once been a robust, trusted silver coin had been reduced to a miserable, nearly worthless bronze or copper token. To maintain the fading illusion of value, the imperial mints utilized highly sophisticated metallurgical techniques to deceive the public. They employed processes like depletion silvering, where the copper blanks were treated with acids like citric acid or vinegar to leach the copper out of the surface, enriching the microscopic layer of silver left behind. Alternatively, the coins were dipped in molten silver chlorides or coated using dangerous mercury amalgams. When these coins were freshly minted, they gleamed with a bright, convincing silver finish. However, this was a fragile veneer. As soon as the coins entered basic circulation and rubbed against each other in the purses of merchants and citizens, the microscopic layer of silver rapidly wore off, exposing the dark, dull, base copper beneath. The Roman citizenry, operating in a highly monetized society, were not fools. They were intimately familiar with the weight, sound, and appearance of good money. Merchants, bankers, and commoners immediately recognized the diminished intrinsic value of the new imperial currency and reacted entirely rationally according to the economic principle later known as Gresham's law. Bad money drives out good. As the state flooded the market with millions of copper tokens masquerading as silver, the public began to hoard the older, purer coins. Good silver was hidden under floorboards, buried in fields, melted down into jewelry, or smuggled out of the empire entirely. This mass hoarding effectively removed the remaining high-quality bullion from circulation, plunging the empire into a severe shortage of actual precious metals and forcing the state to mint even more debased coins. The inevitable mathematical result of this explosion in the money supply was runaway hyperinflation. As the purity of the coin plummeted, the sheer volume of coins in circulation ballooned to absurd levels, drastically pushing up the nominal cost of goods. Historical and pyrological evidence, particularly the incredibly detailed financial documents preserved in the dry sands of Roman Egypt, demonstrates that prices soared relentlessly. It is estimated that prices of everyday commodities inflated by up to 1,000% over the course of roughly 50 years. While the state sometimes attempted to artificially control or subsidize the price of essential state commodities like wheat, the prices of other goods, services, and livestock skyrocketed, indicating a severely bifurcated economy where black markets thrived and official money was held in deep contempt. For the Roman middle classes, the merchants, the skilled artisans, the civil servants, the economic consequences were absolute and tragic. Lifetimes of savings held in currency were utterly wiped out as the purchasing power of the money supply evaporated. Daily necessities became unaffordable. The fundamental trust in the Roman monetary system, a profound social contract that had lubricated the vast economic machinery of the empire for centuries, completely disintegrated. The breakdown of informational value in prices meant that merchants simply refused to accept the debased imperial currency, demanding vast, unmanageable quantities of base metal coins for the simplest transactions. In many regions, the highly sophisticated monetary economy retreated abruptly to primitive barter, with goods traded directly for other goods. The state had trapped itself in a feedback loop of misery. The military inflation spiral fed upon itself. Soldiers, finding that their pay could no longer buy enough food or supplies, mutinied and demanded massive pay increases. Terrified emperors responded to these threats by commanding the mints to produce even more worthless bronze coins to meet the demands, thereby accelerating the inflation and further destroying the very value of the money they were paying the troops. It was a catastrophic failure of fiscal policy that unraveled the economic reality of millions. As if the self-inflicted wounds of political chaos and hyperinflation were not sufficient to bring down the state, the Roman world was abruptly struck by a devastating exogenous demographic catastrophe, the Plague of Cyprian. Erupting around 249 CE during the reign of Emperor Decius and lasting for over a decade, this pandemic, suspected by some modern epidemiologists to have been an aggressive, highly contagious strain of smallpox or perhaps a viral hemorrhagic fever, swept rapidly through the highly connected urban and military networks of the empire. The mortality rates were staggering, plunging the empire into a deep societal trauma. Named after the Bishop of Carthage, who vividly described its horrifying symptoms, the plague left no province untouched. In heavily populated, dense urban centers such as Alexandria in Egypt, historical sources and modern demographic models suggest an almost incomprehensible population decline of up to 62% during the plague's peak. The economic implications of this mass mortality were profound, immediate, and systemic, striking at the very roots of Roman productivity. The catastrophic death toll caused severe, widespread labor shortages across both the agricultural and manufacturing sectors. Following standard Malthusian economic dynamics, similar to the effects observed centuries later during the Black Death in Europe, as the supply of available labor contracted sharply, the bargaining power of the surviving rural and urban workers increased significantly. Workers demanded higher wages, which only compounded the massive inflationary pressures already ripping through the broader economy as a result of the debased currency. Furthermore, the mass death and the terror that caused populations to flee urban centers led to widespread abandonment of farms. The drastic reduction in the agricultural workforce led to plummeting agricultural yields. Famine began to stalk the provinces, exacerbating the mortality rate of the plague by weakening the population and driving further civic unrest and mass migration. The Roman state suddenly found itself presiding over a drastically shrunken tax base. There were simply fewer living citizens to pay taxes, fewer laborers to harvest the vital crops, and fewer young men to conscript into the legions. With collapsing state revenues colliding head-on with the absolute necessity of maintaining a massive military apparatus to defend fractured borders, the structural deficit of the Roman state widened into an unbridgeable chasm. The empire was bleeding out financially and demographically at the exact same time. The central government's response to the total collapse of its own fiat currency, combined with the severe disruption of agricultural supply lines caused by plague and war, was brutal and completely transformative. Unable to purchase supplies on the open market with its worthless bronze tokens, and facing widespread violent mutinies from starving, unpaid troops, the Imperial administration instituted a system known as the Annona Militaris. Initially, the Annona was an ad hoc requisition system utilized only occasionally during specific, localized frontier campaigns to feed the army. However, as the 3rd century crisis deepened, the Annona Militaris was aggressively institutionalized as a regular, universal tax levied directly in kind. Rather than asking for money, the government demanded physical goods, wheat, barley, olive oil, wine, meat, and finished clothing, vestis militaris, directly from landowners and provincial subjects. This represented a massive, tragic regression in macroeconomic sophistication. The Roman state effectively abandoned the highly efficient, monetized market economy it had painstakingly built over centuries, transforming its logistics into a massive, heavily coercive command economy. Bureaucrats and heavily armed soldiers were dispatched directly into the countryside to seize agricultural yields from the populace. The state set fixed valuations for these goods that were drastically lower than actual market prices, effectively stripping peasants and landowners of their entire surplus and frequently cutting deeply into their basic subsistence. The logistical nightmare of this new system was staggering. Moving millions of tons of bulk goods across an empire without the lubricating, frictionless mechanism of a stable currency placed an unbearable physical and financial burden on the local populace. The Roman military and civil administration relied heavily on the cursus publicus, the famous imperial transport and postal system, but local populations were routinely and ruthlessly forced to supply the carts, the oxen, the ships, and the back-breaking manual labor required to move these requisitioned goods entirely under the threat of violent state coercion. This shift alienated the general population from the central government and fundamentally altered the psychological relationship between the citizen and the state. The Roman legionary, previously viewed as the proud guarantor of the Pax Romana and the protector of civilization, increasingly resembled an occupying predator, a glorified bandit demanding his share of the harvest at the point of a sword. The state was no longer a facilitator of commerce. It had become an extractive parasite, draining the countryside merely to keep its armies fed. The relentless, crushing fiscal pressures of the crisis did not only hurt the poor, they entirely destroyed the social and administrative fabric of Roman civic life, specifically targeting the curales, also known as the decurones, the wealthy local elites who populated the municipal city councils. For centuries, the Roman Empire had functioned brilliantly through a system of highly decentralized governance. The actual imperial bureaucracy dispatched from Rome was remarkably small. Local administration, the maintenance of roads and aqueducts, and the collection of taxes were entirely outsourced to these wealthy provincial elites. In the halcyon days of the early Principate, the curales eagerly competed with one another for prestige and political dominance within their home cities. Through a system of civic philanthropy known as eurgetism, they proudly spent their private fortunes to fund public baths, glorious temples, gladiatorial games, and vital infrastructure. Serving on the city council was an honor, a mark of status that separated the elite from the masses. However, as the 3rd century crisis deepened, the imperial government, desperate for resources, shifted the entire burden of its massive deficits directly onto the shoulders of this class. The curales were made personally, legally responsible for the collection of imperial taxes within their jurisdictions, including the crushing quotas of the annona militaris. If the local peasants could not pay their taxes due to the plague, a poor harvest, the collapse of the monetary economy, or barbarian raids destroying their farms, the curales were legally obligated to make up the shortfall from their own private fortunes. Facing absolute financial ruin, with the state perpetually demanding goods that simply did not exist, this once proud elite began a desperate exodus, an event modern historians term the flight of the curales. Members of the municipal senates abandoned their traditional posts in droves, attempting to vanish into the massive imperial bureaucracy, joining the army, seeking refuge in the growing influence of the Christian Church, or simply retreating to their remote rural estates to avoid their civic duties. The state responded to this flight with draconian, authoritarian legislation. Emperors passed laws making curaleal status hereditary and legally inescapable, effectively chaining the middle-upper class to a sinking municipal ship. If a curale attempted to flee, his property was confiscated and he was dragged back to the city council. What was once a prestigious honor became a horrific punishment. The physical result of this destruction of the middle class is starkly visible in the archaeological record, an abrupt empire-wide cessation of civic building projects. The epigraphic record, The ancient tradition of carving honorific inscriptions in marble and stone to celebrate local benefactors goes virtually silent during this period. It signals the death of the classical Roman city as a vibrant engine of culture and politics, reducing it merely to a fortified node for state tax collection. The lethal combination of hyperinflation, the coercive physical extraction of the annona militaris, and severe demographic collapse orchestrated the complete destruction of the integrated Mediterranean market. During the first 2 centuries CE, the Roman Empire had enjoyed a highly complex, interdependent commercial network that stretched across 3 continents. Massive quantities of bulk goods, such as thousands of amphora filled with Bitican olive oil from Spain, fine wines from Gaul, and millions of tons of life-saving grain from Egypt moved with unprecedented ease and volume across the Mare Nostrum, the Roman Mediterranean. This trade was facilitated by a universally trusted currency, the absolute suppression of piracy by the Imperial Navy, and a vast, sophisticated merchant marine capable of moving immense cargoes. The 3rd century obliterated this connectivity. Quantitative archaeological evidence, primarily derived from comprehensive Mediterranean shipwreck data, reveals a precipitous, horrifying drop in maritime traffic. According to statistical models analyzing the remains of ancient shipwrecks, which historians use as a highly reliable proxy for the total volume of seaborne trade, traffic peaked during the late Republic and early Empire, but declined drastically from the mid-2nd century onward, plunging severely during the 3rd century. The bustling shipping lanes fell eerily quiet. The reasons for this collapse were manifold. Rampant inflation meant that merchants could no longer calculate long-term financial risks. The sophisticated system of maritime loans, Fenis Nauticum, which had financed these massive trading expeditions, evaporated because creditors refused to lend money that would be worthless by the time the ship returned. Furthermore, the redirection of the state's logistical apparatus towards the forced collection of the annona militaris heavily disrupted the private shipping capacity that had previously ridden alongside lucrative state contracts. With the withdrawal of state protection, the increased dangers of piracy on the seas, and the decay of overland routes due to widespread banditry and civil war, the costs of transport became utterly prohibitive. The great Mediterranean economic machine, previously characterized by the geographic division of labor and highly specialized regional production, fractured. The empire shattered into isolated, insular, and struggling regional blocks that could no longer rely on the broader Roman world for their survival. As the central state catastrophically failed in its primary duties, maintaining a stable currency and protecting its citizens from violence, the Roman economy underwent a massive spatial and social reorganization. Urban populations, terrified by the prospect of siege by barbarian tribes and starved by the collapse of long-distance supply lines, began a steady migration out of the decaying cities and into the rural hinterlands. Wealthy landowners, possessing the capital to defend themselves and seeking to escape the ruinous taxation imposed on the Curales, retreated from their civic responsibilities. They moved to large, heavily fortified rural estates or villas, such as the precursors to the famous Villa Romana del Caselle in Sicily. These grand estates rapidly became islands of autarky in a sea of chaos. Rather than importing manufactured goods and luxury items through the dying Mediterranean trade networks, these grandees transitioned their vast properties into self-sufficient house economies. They began producing their own food, forging their own tools, weaving their own textiles, and manufacturing their own basic goods, entirely bypassing the monetary economy. Meanwhile, independent smallholder farmers and displaced urbanites found themselves in a desperate situation. Crushed by the dual threats of barbarian raids and the predatory, violent tax collectors of the Imperial army, they were forced to seek protection. Starving and terrified, they surrendered the titles to their lands and effectively their legal freedom to these powerful, heavily armed local landlords in exchange for physical security and a portion of the harvest. This socio-economic process legally bound the rural underclass to the earth as coloni, tenant farmers whose degraded status eventually became legally hereditary. This transition laid the foundational architecture for the serfdom and manorialism of the medieval period. The empire was no longer a network of free citizens, it was becoming a patchwork of unfree laborers toiling for entrenched warlords. However, this transition to a localized proto-feudal economy was not universally peaceful. In heavily burdened and less Romanized regions, particularly in Gaul and Hispania, the intense exploitation of the rural poor triggered massive, violent uprisings. The rebels, known as the Bagadae, formed vast coalitions of ruined peasants, runaway slaves, and military deserters. Driven to the absolute brink by taxes and starvation, they waged vicious, long-running guerrilla wars against both the agents of the Roman state and the wealthy estate owners. These insurgencies further devastated agricultural productivity, disrupted local trade, and underscored the complete breakdown of the Roman social contract. The internal economic rot and social fracturing of the empire inevitably compromised its military integrity, leading to unprecedented geopolitical humiliations. This dynamic reached its horrifying, shocking zenith on the eastern frontier in the year 260 CE. The Sassanid Persian Empire, an aggressive, highly organized, and monetarily stable superpower, sought to capitalize on Rome's severe internal distractions, its exhausted military, and its fiscal weakness. Emperor Valerian, attempting to secure the wealthy eastern provinces and the vital trade routes of the Levant, led a massive Roman army into Mesopotamia to confront the Persian king of kings Shapur I. Plagued by logistical failures, the crippling loss of silver to pay his troops, and the ravages of the plague sweeping through his own ranks, Valerian was outmaneuvered and decisively defeated at the Battle of Edessa. In an event that fundamentally shattered the psychological foundations of the Roman worldview, Valerian was captured alive by the Persians. It was the first time in centuries of Roman history that a reigning emperor had been taken prisoner by a foreign enemy. Contemporary accounts and subsequent historiography seized upon this catastrophe as the ultimate, undeniable symbol of imperial collapse. The Sassanids understood the propaganda value of their triumph. The Persian Res Gestae Divi Sepphoris, the monumental rock reliefs carved into the cliffs at Naqsh-e-Rostam in Iran, immortalized the event. The carvings explicitly depicted the Roman emperor held captive by the hand of Shapur, alongside his praetorian prefect and the humiliated remnants of the Roman high command. Later Christian polemicists, such as the historian Lactantius, relished in spreading lurid tales of Valerian's misery, claiming he was subjected to the greatest insults, utilized as a human footstool for the Persian king to mount his horse, before ultimately being forced to swallow molten gold, or being flayed alive, his skin stuffed with straw and preserved as a grisly trophy in a Persian temple. Regardless of the exact historical veracity of the flaying, the undisputed capture and enslavement of the Augustus of Rome evaporated whatever remaining prestige the central government in Italy commanded, violently accelerating the political splintering of the empire. The capture of Valerian catalyzed the formal political fragmentation of the Roman state, a direct consequence of the central government's economic inability to project power. Recognizing that the central government in Italy was utterly bankrupt, distracted by civil wars, and fundamentally incapable of defending the distant provinces from invasions, regional elites took matters into their own hands to protect their local economies and their borders. In the West, following catastrophic incursions by Germanic tribes across the Rhine, the Roman general Postumus broke away in 260 CE to form what historians call the Gallic Empire, encompassing the provinces of Gaul, Britannia, and Hispania. This was not a barbarian conquest, nor was it a rejection of Roman culture. It was a desperate defensive reorganization. Postumus established his own senate, formed his own administrative apparatus, and critically, minted his own coinage, which was often of superior quality to the debased output of the central administration in Rome. By doing so, he successfully repelled Germanic raids and shielded the Western economic zone from the worst of the chaos emanating from the Mediterranean core. Simultaneously, in the east, the wealthy cosmopolitan oasis city of Palmyra stepped into the massive power vacuum left by Valerian's defeat. Under the leadership of Odenathus and later his famous widow, the formidable Queen Zenobia, the Palmyrene Empire broke away. Palmyra successfully defended the highly lucrative eastern provinces, including Syria and the absolutely vital grain basket of Egypt, from further Persian incursions. While these breakaway states severely injured the central treasury in Rome by cutting off massive streams of tax revenue and agricultural surplus, they ironically saved Roman civilization. By providing the localized stability and economic protection that Rome could no longer afford, the Gallic and Palmyrene empires prevented the total annihilation and barbarian overrun of the most productive regions of the ancient world. The psychological and physical reality of a fractured, highly vulnerable empire was most starkly materialized in the capital city itself. For centuries, the city of Rome had expanded far beyond its ancient republican boundaries, sprawling elegantly across its 7 hills. It bathed in the supreme security of the Pax Romana. As an open, unwalled metropolis, the true borders of Rome were the legions stationed thousands of miles away on the Rhine and the Euphrates. However, as the Alemanni and other Germanic tribes penetrated deep into the Italian peninsula during the crisis, routing Roman armies and directly threatening the heart of the empire, the illusion of invulnerability was permanently and terrifyingly shattered. Between 271 and 275 CE, Emperor Aurelian, who ended the breakaway Gallic and Palmyrene empires, undertook the massive logistical and financial challenge of constructing the Aurelianic walls. This monumental defensive circuit stretched for nearly 19 kilometers around the sprawling capital, reaching heights of up to 16 meters in subsequent centuries. The energetics and rapid planning of this massive construction project perfectly reflect the desperate economic realities of the time. Built in tremendous haste, the walls were constructed utilizing vast quantities of recycled materials. Imperial engineers pragmatically incorporated existing aqueducts, monuments, amphitheaters, and even tombs directly into the fabric of the wall to reduce construction time and minimize astronomical costs. The project also served a vital immediate domestic economic function. In 271 CE, the city of Rome was rocked by a massive and incredibly bloody rebellion by the city's own mint workers. This riot was fundamentally driven by the rampant corruption, economic chaos, and public fury surrounding the deeply debased currency that the mint workers themselves were producing. In the aftermath of putting down this rebellion, the massive construction of the wall provided urgent paid employment to thousands of idle, potentially dangerous citizens. Yet beyond its immediate tactical utility and its function as a massive public works program, the Aurelianic Wall stood as a towering stone monument to a profoundly changed world. It was a profound architectural admission that the Roman Empire was no longer an expansive, secure hegemon ruling the known world, but a frightened fortress under perpetual siege. It fundamentally and permanently reshaped the mental geography of the Roman citizen, enclosing them in an architecture of despair. Despite the overwhelming narrative of decay, disease, and hyperinflation, the crisis of the 3rd century was not a uniform, monolithic apocalypse across the entire expanse of the empire. A nuanced, modern examination of the archaeological, palynological, pollen, and economic data reveals profound regional variations. Most notably, while the western provinces and the Italian peninsula suffered acute deurbanization, massive violence, and absolute market collapse, the region of Anatolia, modern-day Turkey, demonstrated remarkable economic resilience and even periods of distinct growth. Driven by the area's incredibly strategic geographical position as a commercial transit nexus linking the trade routes of the Deep East with the Mediterranean, and buoyed by its highly developed, sophisticated urban networks, the Anatolian regional economy adapted to the chaos rather than collapsing under it. Scientific analysis of sediment cores drawn from Anatolian lakes, such as Buldan Yayla and Iznik, indicates that while the broader empire burned, the Anatolian countryside actually underwent intense, exponential agricultural expansion. Local farmers massively increased the cultivation of olives, capitalizing on the highly lucrative regional oil trade, rapidly transforming the landscape into highly productive monoculture plantations. Furthermore, vast studies of ancient bronze coinage found in regional excavations reveal that Anatolian cities, such as Tripolis, remained highly integrated into regional monetary exchanges throughout the 3rd century. This suggests that while the macro-Mediterranean market failed, localized but highly robust trade networks in the East not only survived, but actively evolved to fill the void. This localized economic vitality in Asia Minor underscores a much broader, highly significant geopolitical trend that would define the next millennium. The economic, demographic, and political center of gravity of the Roman world was shifting inexorably eastward. The remarkable resilience of Anatolia, combined with the agricultural wealth of Egypt and the trade routes of the Levant, provided the deep, unshakable economic foundation that allowed the eastern half of the Roman Empire to weather the crisis of the 3rd century. It was this surviving eastern wealth that would shortly allow Emperor Diocletian to shift the focus of imperial power away from Rome, and it set the ultimate stage for the survival and flourishing of the Byzantine Empire for another 1,000 years. When Diocletian seized power in 284 CE, he inherited a state that was administratively fragmented and economically paralyzed. His approach to these interconnected crises was decisively authoritarian, rooted in the belief that the empire's structural failures could be rectified through sheer imperial willpower, centralized planning, and bureaucratic micromanagement. Recognizing that the empire was too vast and the military threats too complex for a single ruler to manage, he established the Tetrarchy, a system of 4 co-emperors dividing the administrative and military responsibilities of the Roman world. To further secure the state against internal rebellion and external invasion, Diocletian radically decentralized provincial power while centralizing bureaucratic control. He more than doubled the number of provinces, breaking them down from 40 massive jurisdictions into 105 smaller administrative units. While this reorganization succeeded in improving the responsiveness of the state to localized crises and significantly reduced the ability of any single provincial governor to launch a successful usurpation, it carried a monumental financial cost. The administrative partition required a 5-fold increase in the number of high-salaried civilian officials, praetorian prefects, and vicari, all of whom required extensive staffs and lavish accommodations befitting the newly elevated imperial bureaucracy. Simultaneously, to secure the borders, the size of the military was expanded significantly, and the base pay for military personnel was increased sixfold to compensate for decades of inflation. The financial burden of this massively expanded state apparatus was unprecedented. Diocletian was attempting to fund an exponentially larger government and military on an agricultural tax base that had been severely depleted by decades of plague and warfare. As the state continued to spend vastly beyond its means, the inflationary spiral accelerated, threatening to undermine the very military stability the Tetrarchy had been designed to achieve. In 301 CE, faced with runaway inflation that was devastating the purchasing power of his newly expanded army, Diocletian enacted the Edict on Maximum Prices, known formally as the Edictum de Praetis Rerum Venalium. This legislation stands as one of the most ambitious, comprehensive, and ultimately disastrous experiments in coercive economic intervention in the ancient world. The edict sought to halt inflation instantly by imposing absolute empire-wide price ceilings on an exhaustive list of over 1,000 distinct goods, services, and wages. The philosophical underpinnings of the edict, articulated forcefully in its extensive preamble, revealed the imperial administration's profound misunderstanding of macroeconomic principles. Diocletian framed the rampant inflation not as a predictable symptom of the state's own relentless monetary debasement and massive deficit spending, but entirely as a moral failing of the civilian populace. The emperor launched into a vitriolic invective against the boundless greed of evil traders, speculators, and profiteers, accusing them of conspiring to rob the helpless public and the noble soldiers of the empire into beggary. By moralizing the economic crisis, the state absolved itself of any fiscal responsibility, treating inflation as a criminal conspiracy rather than a structural reality. The scope of the price controls was staggering in its micromanagement. The edict established maximum allowable prices for everything from basic agricultural staples like wheat, barley, and rice to manufactured goods such as bed linens and footwear to luxury items. Crucially, the government recognized the existence of a wage price spiral. Therefore, the edict mandated strict maximum daily wages for a vast array of professions, including agricultural laborers, craftsmen, weavers, teachers, and lawyers. From the perspective of the imperial bureaucracy, wages and commodity prices formed a single inflationary engine that could only be halted by freezing the entire economy simultaneously. To ensure compliance, the state attached terrifying penalties to the edict. Anyone caught selling goods above the mandated maximum price or even purchasing goods at inflated rates was subject to the death penalty. The penalty for hoarding goods, defined as holding back inventory from the market, was likewise execution. The imperial government actively encouraged a culture of informants to police daily transactions and explicitly forbade any circumvention of the regulations through barter or clandestine collusion. Despite its unprecedented severity, the Edict on Maximum Prices was a spectacular failure, collapsing under the weight of its own economic contradictions within a few years, and in some regions within a matter of months. The fundamental flaw of the legislation was its attempt to impose static price ceilings on a highly dynamic economic system without addressing the underlying causes of inflation, namely currency debasement and severe supply shortages caused by war and plague. By setting the maximum prices far below the natural market equilibrium, the edict made legal commerce economically unviable. Producers and merchants found that the cost of producing or transporting goods exceeded the legal selling price, meaning that complying with the law guaranteed financial ruin. Rather than stabilizing the cost of living, the edict triggered immediate and severe artificial scarcity. Merchants simply withdrew their inventory from the official marketplaces, refusing to sell at a mandated loss, or produced only the bare minimum required to create the illusion of compliance. This massive withdrawal of goods catalyzed the explosive growth of black markets, where essential commodities were traded secretly at prices significantly higher than both the legal maximums and the prices that had existed before the edict was issued. The contemporary Christian chronicler Lactantius, writing shortly after Diocletian's abdication, provided a harrowing account of the edict's social fallout. He recorded that the edict led to widespread economic paralysis, terror, and the frequent shedding of blood, as fear of execution drove the economy entirely underground, and minor disputes over trivial transactions escalated into lethal state violence. Furthermore, maintaining strict enforcement across an empire stretching from the Atlantic to the Euphrates proved administratively impossible. Local officials, lacking the manpower to police millions of daily transactions and fearful of inciting outright urban rebellion over food shortages, gradually turned a blind eye to the rampant violations. Ultimately, the edict fell into disuse, serving as a powerful historical testament to the limitations of authoritarian command economies when deployed against fundamental market forces. While the attempt to control prices through decree failed, Diocletian was highly successful in overhauling the Roman tax system, replacing the chaotic and inflation-ravaged monetary levies of the Principate with a highly rigid, primarily in-kind taxation framework known as the Jugatio Capitatio. Recognizing that the debased fiat currency was virtually useless for sustaining the real material needs of the military and the bureaucracy, the state restructured its revenue extraction to capture physical resources directly from the agricultural sector, which accounted for approximately 60% of the empire's total economic output. To implement this new system, the imperial administration undertook a monumental logistical achievement: a comprehensive empire-wide census that meticulously cataloged the land, labor, and livestock of an estimated 60 to 70 million inhabitants across 5 million square kilometers of territory. The resulting tax formula, the Jugatio Capitatio, was designed to evaluate the true productive profitability of an agricultural estate by combining two distinct interlocking metrics. The first metric was the Jugatio, which measured the physical land. In a departure from simpler historical models that taxed purely on total acreage, the Diocletian census categorized land into specific fiscal units based on its varying quality, good, regular, or poor, and the specific type of crop it was suited to yield, distinguishing between grain fields, vineyards, and olive groves. The second metric was the capitatio, which measured the human and animal labor available to cultivate that land. By inextricably linking the land to the labor force, the state sought to capture the added value of complex agricultural production. For instance, a farming estate equipped with the specialized personnel and livestock required to process its own wine or olive oil was assessed at a significantly higher tax rate than a simple grain farm of identical size, precisely because its labor force generated a higher value final product. In theory, the Jugatio Capitatio system was intended to promote fiscal equity by eliminating ancient geographical exemptions, including the historic tax immunity enjoyed by the Italian peninsula, and establishing a standardized, predictable revenue stream for the state budget. However, in practice, the system was profoundly rigid and ultimately devastating to the rural population. The tax assessments were calculated and fixed in advance based on the census, initially established in 5-year cycles and later extended to 15-year cycles known as indictions. Because the tax liabilities were locked in for years at a time, the system made absolutely no allowances for the volatile realities of agricultural life. Farmers were legally obligated to deliver their exact assessed quotas of grain, oil, and livestock to the imperial exactors, regardless of whether their specific region had suffered from drought, famine, locust plagues, earthquakes, or the devastation of barbarian raids. The central authorities were unwilling to grant tax relief or reduce the indiction quotas except in the event of massive, undeniable catastrophes. Consequently, during years of poor harvests, peasant farmers who could not raise the necessary in-kind taxes frequently abandoned their ancestral lands in sheer desperation, fleeing into the wilderness or turning to outlawry to escape the brutal enforcement of the state tax collectors. To ensure that the wealth of the urban centers did not escape this aggressive new fiscal net, Constantine later introduced an additional levy known as the collatio lustralis, a highly burdensome tax specifically targeting merchants, artisans, and industrial enterprise, ensuring that every facet of the Roman economy was subjected to intense imperial extraction. The logic of the late Roman command economy did not stop at the extraction of agricultural wealth. It extended deeply into the systematic regimentation of urban, commercial, and industrial labor. To guarantee that the massive logistical necessities of the state, the sprawling military, and the megacities of Rome and Constantinople were met without fail, the imperial government transformed previously voluntary trade associations into coercive hereditary state guilds. During the Republic and the early Principate, private professional associations known as collegia had operated largely as civic organizations, functioning as social clubs, burial societies, and mutual aid groups for craftsmen and merchants sharing a common trade or religious cult. While they sought state recognition, they were fundamentally voluntary organizations. Under the Dominate, however, the state commandeered these associations, stripping them of their voluntary nature and converting them into indispensable instruments of imperial survival. Professions that were deemed vital to the security and sustenance of the state were legally frozen. The state commandeered the essential professional associations, including the naviculari, who were the wealthy ship owners responsible for transporting the crucial grain supply from the breadbaskets of Egypt and North Africa to the imperial capitals, the pastores, or millers and bakers who processed the state grain for the massive urban dole, the armamentari, who manufactured the weapons and armor required to supply the hundreds of thousands of soldiers in the legions, and the lenunculari, the specialized harbor ferrymen who guided marine vessels to their moorings and transported cargo ashore. Similarly, the miners who extracted the silver and gold required for the imperial mints were bound tightly to their dangerous subterranean occupations. Historical records indicate that miners in Gaul grew so desperate under the brutal conditions of state service that they attempted en masse to flee to Sardinia or to seek refuge on private agricultural estates, prompting the emperors to issue strict laws penalizing anyone caught harboring a fugitive miner. To secure these vital supply lines across generations, the imperial administration decreed that these essential professions must be strictly hereditary. The son of a soldier was legally obligated to become a soldier upon reaching maturity, regardless of his personal aptitude or desire, a policy implemented to combat the severe recruitment shortages that plagued the late army. The sons of bakers were compelled to remain in the bakeries, and the descendants of shipowners were required by law to continue investing the entirety of their inherited fortunes into the maritime supply chain. This draconian legislation effectively eradicated the concept of a free labor market in the essential sectors of the Roman economy. The state no longer viewed human capital as a resource to be allocated organically by market forces, but as a strategic asset to be deployed entirely by imperial command. While this immense regimentation succeeded in maintaining the necessary supply lines to keep the army equipped and the urban centers fed in the short term, it stifled technological and economic innovation, destroyed the avenues of social mobility that had characterized the earlier empire, and generated immense resentment among the populace, fundamentally altering the relationship between the citizen and the state. The rigid architecture of the late Roman tax system, combined with shifting demographic realities, had profound unintended consequences for the social structure of the empire, most notably in the total transformation of agricultural labor. During the expansive era of the Roman Republic and the early Principate, the agricultural economy, particularly in Italy and Sicily, was heavily reliant on vast plantation-style estates known as Latifundia, which were worked by millions of chattel slaves acquired through relentless wars of military conquest. However, as the empire shifted from an aggressive posture of continuous territorial expansion to a defensive posture focused on maintaining existing static borders, the steady, massive influx of cheap war captives entirely dried up. The cost of maintaining massive slave populations purely through natural reproduction became increasingly uneconomical, prompting large landowners to seek alternative models of labor exploitation. Simultaneously, the mechanics of the newly implemented Eugatio Capitatio tax system required a stable, predictable, and immobile rural population. The imperial treasury quickly realized that the land tax assessment, the Eugatio, was entirely worthless if the peasant laborers, the capita, required to actually cultivate those fields migrated to the cities, joined the army, or fled to other estates in search of better working conditions. The fundamental logic of the tax state demanded that the peasant be permanently tethered to the soil he worked. This intersection of demographic shifts and acute fiscal desperation birthed the colonate system. Initially, coloni were legally free tenant farmers who leased plots of land from large estate owners, paying their rent either in cash or as a predetermined portion of their harvest. Over the course of the 3rd and 4th centuries, however, the legal distinction between a free colonus and an agricultural slave systematically evaporated. To satisfy the rigid demands of the imperial tax collectors, the state began to intervene directly in the contractual relationship between the landlord and the tenant. The definitive legal turning point occurred in 332 CE, when the Emperor Constantine issued a sweeping decree, preserved in the Codex Theodosianus, which legally bound the coloni to the specific estates they worked. The language of the decree was unambiguous, brutal, and transformative. Tenant farmers who attempted to leave their designated land were to be hunted down, bound in chains, and explicitly reduced to a servile condition. The legislation ordered that runaway coloni be treated identically to fugitive slaves, compelling them to fulfill their agricultural duties through physical coercion. Furthermore, the law mandated that any landowner who harbored a runaway tenant was held legally responsible for the fugitive's capitation tax for the entire duration they were absent from their rightful estate, ensuring that the elite policed each other. Constantine's decree effectively ended freedom of movement for the vast majority of the Roman agricultural population. The status of the colonus became deeply hereditary. Children born to tied tenants inherited their parents' bondage to the soil. If an agricultural estate was sold or transferred, the coloni were alienated alongside the land, transferred to the new owner as though they were livestock or permanent agricultural fixtures. The tenant farmers lost the right to intermarry freely with non-bound citizens and were strictly barred from enlisting in the military, entering the clergy, or engaging in urban commerce without the express permission of their landlord, lest the estate lose its taxable labor force. Through the legal institution of the colonate, the late Roman state inadvertently laid the demographic, economic, and legal foundation for medieval serfdom. The imperial administration, in its desperate bid to guarantee tax revenues, empowered the rural aristocracy with near-absolute jurisdictional authority over their tenants. The great magnates became responsible not only for collecting the imperial taxes from their coloni, but also for administering local justice and physically preventing their flight. As central authority eventually weakened and collapsed in the Western Empire, these massive, self-sufficient, legally autonomous estates evolved seamlessly into the manorial system of the Middle Ages, cementing a proto-feudal social order centuries before the final collapse of the imperial government. The economic coercion of the late empire was inextricably linked to a profound restructuring of the monetary system, a restructuring that created a starkly bifurcated economy that heavily favored the ruling elites at the direct expense of the general populace. Recognizing the catastrophic failure of Diocletian's price edict and the ongoing collapse of the silver currency, Constantine the Great initiated a sweeping monetary reform centered on the creation of a new, highly pure gold coin, the Solidus. Constantine leveraged the massive gold reserves confiscated from pagan temples across the empire to mint the Solidus in vast quantities, injecting it directly into the upper echelons of the imperial economy. The Solidus achieved what Diocletian's coercive price controls could not. It successfully established a highly stable, universally trusted store of value and medium of exchange. However, this economic stability was profoundly unequal in its distribution. The Solidus was a high-denomination coin, possessing far too much intrinsic value for everyday transactions in the local markets. Consequently, it circulated almost exclusively among the very apex of society, the senatorial aristocracy, the high-ranking military officers, and the sprawling imperial bureaucracy. For the vast majority of the Roman population, the urban poor, the artisans, and the legally bound coloni, the introduction of the Solidus offered absolutely no relief from the economic crisis. They were forced to continue conducting their daily economic lives with fiat copper and bronze coinage, which the state continued to overprint and debase to cover minor expenses. This dual monetary system generated profound structural inequality. As the state increasingly demanded that major taxes be paid in gold, a powerful class of tax intermediaries emerged to facilitate the exchange. These intermediaries, often corrupt local magistrates, military commanders, and imperial bureaucrats, controlled the interface between the gold economy of the state and the fiat economy of the populace. Because the exchange rate between the stable gold Solidus and the wildly inflating bronze coinage fluctuated constantly, these intermediaries were perfectly positioned to manipulate the rates of tax commutation. They would assess the tax burden of the lower classes in highly inflated bronze currency, extract the maximum possible physical value from the peasantry, convert a portion of the proceeds into gold to satisfy the imperial treasury, and pocket the vast difference. This mechanism of financial extraction allowed the bureaucratic and military elite to amass enormous private fortunes, while the purchasing power of the lower classes was systematically annihilated. It was not until the reforms of the Valentinian dynasty, 364 to 378 CE, that the state finally managed to fix the legal nominal value of the Solidus, temporarily curtailing the rampant profiteering of the tax intermediaries by re-establishing a centralized price for taxation. Nevertheless, the damage to the social fabric was deeply irreversible. The fiscal policies of the dominate had institutionalized an economic divide so vast that the rural peasantry increasingly felt no allegiance to the survival of the Roman state, the detachment that would prove fatal as the empire faced mounting external pressures. The political and economic trajectory of the Roman Empire fractured irrevocably following its formal administrative division in 395 CE into Western and Eastern halves. While the two halves remained theoretically united under a shared legal and ideological framework, their underlying demographic and economic realities diverged dramatically. This profound divergence explains why the Eastern Roman Empire, eventually known as the Byzantine Empire, survived and thrived for another millennium, while the Western Roman Empire suffered total systemic collapse by 476 CE. The political economy of the Eastern Roman Empire, governed from the heavily fortified, impregnable capital of Constantinople, was characterized by immense structural and geographical advantages. Geographically, the East sat directly at the nexus of the most lucrative global trade networks of late antiquity. Constantinople commanded the vital maritime straits connecting the Mediterranean to the Black Sea, while simultaneously serving as the western terminus for overland trade routes extending through Sassanid Persia to India and Han China. The eastern state aggressively capitalized on this geographic fortune, imposing a uniform 10% tariff on all imports and exports passing through its territory, a policy that flooded the imperial treasury with stable, highly liquid gold revenue. Furthermore, the Eastern Empire remained densely populated, highly urbanized, and thoroughly monetized. While the West rapidly ruralized, the East maintained a robust network of thriving manufacturing and commercial centers, from Alexandria in Egypt and Antioch in Syria to the prosperous cities of the Aegean. Regions within the Eastern Empire engaged in highly specialized, market-oriented industrial production. For example, the Peloponnese mass-produced olive oil on a scale sufficient to export to Constantinople. Corinth maintained a lucrative monopoly on high-quality glazed ceramics, and cities like Athens and Thebes became bustling hubs for an immensely profitable textile and silk industry, drawing raw materials from as far away as Calabria. This profound regional economic integration fostered immense resilience against external shocks and provided the Eastern emperors with a deep, reliable tax base. When the East faced severe military threats from the Sassanid Persians or the Huns, it possessed the financial capacity to either field massive, well-supplied armies or to pay exorbitant diplomatic tributes to buy peace, effectively neutralizing threats without losing core sovereign territory. In stark contrast, the Western Roman Empire suffered from a chronic, compounding crisis of revenue extraction. The Western economy was fundamentally agrarian and lacked the vibrant commercial transit hubs and specialized manufacturing centers that enriched the East. As the demographic and economic center of gravity shifted inexorably to Constantinople, the West was left to finance a massive, professional military apparatus on a steadily shrinking agricultural tax base. Modern demographic structural theory, specifically secular cycles, suggests that the West actually experienced a premature economic decline driven by extreme elite overproduction and infighting, leading to an exceptionally top-heavy social pyramid that drained resources from the productive classes long before the major barbarian invasions of the 5th century. The collapse of the Western tax base was actively accelerated by the predatory behavior of its own aristocracy. Unlike the East, where the centralized imperial bureaucracy maintained firm dominance over the landowning class, the senatorial elite in the West grew vastly more powerful than the central government. These ultra-wealthy patricians retreated to their massive, fortified rural Latifundia and utilized their immense political influence to engage in systemic, large-scale tax evasion. Through a legally ambiguous mechanism known as suffragium, the purchase of political influence, and the extension of patronage networks, wealthy Western landowners successfully shielded their vast estates from imperial tax assessors. As the elite opted out of the fiscal system, the burden of funding the state fell entirely on the urban middle classes and the already impoverished rural peasantry. This dynamic produced the tragedy of the curiae, or decurions, the class of prosperous merchants and mid-level landowners who comprised the local city councils across the Western Empire. Historically, serving as a decurion was a mark of supreme civic pride. They funded public baths, temples, games, and local infrastructure out of their own pockets to gain prestige. However, under the brutal fiscal logic of the dominate, the imperial government made the curiae personally and legally responsible for collecting the imperial taxes within their municipal districts. As the peasantry was crushed by inflation and elite tax evasion shrank the available tax pool, the curiae routinely failed to meet the extortionate quotas demanded by the central government. The state's response was merciless. The curiae were forced to make up any shortfall in the municipal tax collection out of their own private wealth. If a decurion could not pay the difference, his property was confiscated by the state, and he was subjected to physical torture or execution. Predictably, this policy utterly annihilated the Western middle class. Desperate curii abandoned their cities, attempting to flee into the clergy, the military, or the relative safety of a senator's patronage network to escape their financial obligations. To prevent this exodus, the state made the position of decurion hereditary and escapable, effectively imprisoning the urban middle class in a cycle of financial ruin. The systematic destruction of the curial class hollowed out the civic infrastructure of the Western Empire. Urban centers decayed, public works were abandoned, and local governance dissolved into localized tyranny. The internal decay of the Western political economy was ultimately transformed into terminal collapse by a catastrophic external shock that fundamentally broke the empire's logistical capabilities: the Vandal conquest of North Africa. During the massive migrations of the early 5th century, the Western Empire lost significant control over the provinces of Gaul, Britain, and Hispania to various Germanic confederations, but the imperial core in Italy managed to survive largely because it retained absolute control of the Diocese of Africa Proconsularis, encompassing modern-day Tunisia and eastern Algeria. North Africa was the undisputed economic engine of the Western Empire. It was densely urbanized, highly productive, insulated from northern barbarian invasions by the Mediterranean Sea, and served as the absolute center of the grain and oil annona, the public supply system that fed the massive population of the city of Rome. More importantly, North Africa provided the largest share of liquid tax revenue to the Western imperial treasury outside of the Italian peninsula itself. In 429 CE, a massive coalition of Vandals and Alans, led by King Gaiseric, crossed the Strait of Gibraltar from Spain into Africa, steadily advancing until they captured the heavily fortified and immensely wealthy capital of Carthage in 439 CE. The geopolitical and economic consequences of this event were devastating and irreversible. Almost overnight, the Western Roman Empire lost its breadbasket and its primary source of state funding. The vast agricultural estates belonging to the Roman senatorial elite were violently expropriated by the Vandal aristocracy, ending centuries of rent extraction. The massive grain fleets that had supplied Rome for generations ceased to sail under imperial command. Instead, the Western government was forced into the humiliating and financially ruinous position of purchasing its own former grain from the Vandals at exorbitant rates. Furthermore, the Vandals rapidly transitioned into a formidable naval power, utilizing the captured shipyards of Carthage to build fleets that seized the islands of Sicily, Sardinia, Corsica, and the Balearics. They wrested control of the Western Mediterranean from Roman navies, crippling the maritime trade networks that were the lifeblood of the coastal economy, and actively raiding commerce. In 455 CE, the Vandals launched a massive amphibious assault and sacked the city of Rome itself, a pillaging far more destructive than the Wisigothic sack of 410 CE. Despite launching 2 massive, hugely expensive military expeditions by sea in the 460s, largely bankrolled by the Eastern Empire, the Romans failed to overthrow the Vandals and reclaim North Africa. The permanent loss of customs duties, combined with the total loss of African agricultural taxation, plunged the Western imperial treasury into an irrecoverable deficit. The immediate and fatal victim of this financial starvation was the Western Roman military machine. The late Roman army was a massive, highly professionalized force. While the armies of the Republic were raised temporarily from the citizen body, the late empire maintained a standing force estimated between 400,000 and 600,000 men. Despite its massive total size, logistical limitations, and the necessity of defending thousands of miles of frontier, field armies engaged in actual battles, such as at Adrianople or the Catalonian plains, rarely exceeded 20 to 40,000 men. Nonetheless, maintaining the total apparatus required constant, immense injections of coin for salaries, equipment, and logistical support. Without the revenues from North Africa, the Western emperor simply could no longer afford to pay, equip, or field standing professional armies. The state was forced to rely almost entirely on federated barbarian contingents known as foederati, autonomous Germanic tribes settled within imperial borders who fought in exchange for land grants rather than coin. This reliance fundamentally decentralized military power. By the mid-5th century, the Western Roman Empire had been reduced to a phantom state. The imperial government, isolated in Ravenna, controlled little more than the Italian peninsula, possessed virtually no tax base, and its defense was entirely contracted out to Germanic warlords, who commanded loyalties the emperor could no longer afford to buy. When the barbarian general Odoacer deposed the teenage emperor Romulus Augustulus in 476 CE, he was not destroying a functioning state, he was merely acknowledging a political and economic reality that had been sealed decades earlier with the fall of Carthage and the loss of the African tax base. The Western Empire did not fall in a single cataclysmic battle. It collapsed because it had been systematically starved of the revenues required to maintain the apparatus of a complex state, rendering the central government irrelevant to the very provinces it claimed to rule. Ultimately, the economic legislation of the late Roman Empire did not save the ancient world. Rather, it served as the legal and demographic midwife to the Middle Ages. The binding of the colony to the land, the militarization of civil society, and the localization of economic and judicial power into the hands of a rural aristocracy laid the inescapable foundations for medieval manorialism and serfdom. When the central political authority of the West finally dissolved in 476 CE, the proto-feudal economic structures established by Diocletian and Constantine endured, defining the contours of European society for the next 1,000 years.